Dust hung in the Nevada air like a promise waiting to be kept. The kind of dust that settled into the creases of a man's hands and never quite washed out, no matter how many years passed or how far he traveled from the place it first found him. Captain David Cross stood at the edge of Willow Creek Ranch, watching the sun drop behind mountains that had witnessed generations of his family learning what it meant to carry a rifle with purpose. The year was 1990, and his daughter Maya, all of 4 years old, sat cross-legged in the dirt beside him, her small hands folded in her lap the way he had taught her. Not fidgeting, not complaining about the heat or the weight, just sitting, present, aware. Already understanding at an age when most children only understood ice cream and cartoons that patience was the first lesson and everything else would follow. David did not hold a rifle that afternoon. He held binoculars, scanning the ridgeline where the land broke into gullies and sage, where coyotes moved in the failing light and mule deer paused to test the wind before committing to open ground. Maya watched him, not the horizon. She studied the way his shoulders stayed level, the way his breathing never changed even when something moved in the glass, the way his finger rested along the side of the binoculars instead of pressing impatiently against them. When the coyote finally appeared, slipping between two junipers 300 yards out, David lowered the glass and handed it to his daughter. Her hands were too small to hold it steady, so he knelt behind her, guiding her grip, teaching her how to brace her elbows against her knees, how to let the weight settle instead of fighting it. She found the animal after a long moment, her breath catching not with excitement, but with recognition. The coyote paused, testing the air, completely unaware of the child and the soldier watching from across the basin. David spoke quietly, his voice carrying no farther than necessary. "What do you see?" Maya's answer came without hesitation. "A mama, she's hunting for her babies." "How do you know?" "Her belly's thin. She's hungry, but she's not eating. She's taking food back." David felt something tighten in his chest, the same thing that tightened every time his daughter surprised him with how much she noticed, how much she understood without being told. He let her watch until the coyote disappeared into the shadows, then took the binoculars and set them aside. "Do we shoot her?" Maya asked, turning to look up at him with eyes that did not blink, did not look away, that held his gaze the way a soldier holds a line. "No." "Why not?" "Papa Tom shot a coyote last month. He said they're vermin." David settled onto the ground beside her, his back against the same fence post his own father had leaned against 30 years earlier, teaching the same lessons in the same failing light. "Papa Tom's not wrong. Coyotes take chickens and calves when they get the chance. But that mama out there, she's not vermin. She's a mother doing what mothers do, taking care of her own." Maya processed this in silence, her small face serious. "So when do we shoot?" "When there's no other choice. When something needs protecting and you're the only one who can do it. A rifle's not for killing, baby girl. It's for protecting from a distance. You remember that?" She nodded once, solemn, and in that moment David saw the future stretching ahead of them both. He saw the uniform she would one day wear, the oaths she would take, the choices she would face when the simple lesson of a desert afternoon became the brutal calculus of a battlefield half a world away. He saw it all, and he prayed silently that when those moments came, she would remember the coyote, the hunger, the choice not to shoot. The wind picked up as the sun touched the mountains, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain that would never quite reach them. David stood and offered his hand, pulling his daughter to her feet. They walked back toward the house together, her small hand in his large one, their shadows stretching long across land that had shaped soldiers long before either of them was born. That night, after Maya fell asleep, David sat at the kitchen table under the yellow glow of a lamp that had illuminated 3 generations of cleaning rifles and reloading ammunition. He opened a leather journal, worn soft at the edges from years of sweat and handling, and wrote in the precise block letters he had learned at Fort Benning 20 years earlier. The entry was simple. "Taught Maya about choice today. 4 years old and she already understands the weight of not pulling the trigger. Pray she never has to learn the weight of pulling it." He closed the journal and set his pen down, staring at nothing in particular. Remembering Black Hawk Down, remembering Somalia, remembering the faces of rangers he was supposed to protect from Overwatch and could not. 18 years old, some of them. Kids who trusted that someone was watching, that someone would keep them safe while they did the hard work of closing with the enemy. He had failed them, not through lack of skill or courage, but through the simple mathematics of distance and angles and walls that blocked sightlines when they mattered most. He had come home with all his parts intact, but something broken inside, something that no amount of training or discipline could repair. So he had stopped deploying and started teaching, shaping the next generation of snipers, drilling into them the sacred responsibility of watching over others from places they could not see. His daughter would inherit that responsibility. He knew it as surely as he knew the sun would rise tomorrow over the same mountains that had watched him grow from boy to man to soldier to father. Maya would wear the uniform, carry the rifle, take the shot. And when she did, he wanted her to remember the coyote, the hunger, the choice. The years passed the way years pass in places where the land changes slowly and people even slower. Maya grew tall and lean, her hands losing the softness of childhood, her eyes sharpening the way desert eyes sharpen when they learn to read heat shimmer and mirage, when they learn to see what should not be there by recognizing what should. By the time she turned 12, she could outshoot most adults at the county range, placing rounds through the same hole at distances that made older men shake their heads and mutter about natural talent. David never corrected them, never explained that talent was just another word for 10,000 repetitions, for nights when other kids watched television and his daughter lay prone in the dirt, learning to feel the heartbeat through the stock, learning to time the trigger press between pulses, learning that the rifle was an extension of will and discipline, not magic. The year she turned 12 was also the year Jake Torres came into their lives. Jake arrived at the ranch on a September afternoon when the heat had finally broken, and the cottonwoods along the creek showed the first yellow edges of autumn. He drove a beat-up Ford Ranger that had seen better days and several combat deployments worth of hard use, dust coating its panels like camouflage. When he stepped out, David recognized the walk immediately, the economy of movement that marks someone who had learned to carry heavy loads over long distances, who had learned that wasted motion could mean wasted energy when energy was the difference between making the objective and falling short. Jake was 25 then, lean and quiet, with the kind of face that would look the same at 50 as it did at 25, sun-darkened and weather-creased, built for endurance rather than beauty. He wore faded jeans and a t-shirt that had once been black but had faded to charcoal, and when he shook David's hand, his grip was firm but not aggressive, professional but not distant. "Sir," he said, and that single word carried all the respect and formality of a subordinate addressing a superior officer, even though David had retired from active duty 3 years earlier and wore no rank anymore. "Jake Torres." David returned the handshake, then gestured toward the house. "Long drive from Benning. You hungry?" "I could eat, sir, but I didn't come for a meal. Came to thank you." David studied the younger man for a long moment, reading the story written in the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with weight balanced, ready to move in any direction without telegraphing intent. "Thank me for what?" "For saving my life at sniper school. You probably don't remember. I was the kid who couldn't read wind worth a damn, kept missing left at 800. You stayed 3 hours after class for 2 weeks straight, teaching me to see heat shimmer, to read mirage layers. Nobody else would have bothered, but you did." David remembered. He remembered a lot of students over the years, kids who came through with talent or determination or both. Kids who left with skills that would keep them alive and keep others alive when everything went to hell. But he especially remembered the ones who struggled, who wanted it badly enough to stay when others would have quit, who understood that the difference between good enough and excellent was measured in fractions of inches at distances where fractions of inches meant everything. "You passed," David said simply. "That's all that matters." "No, sir." Jake's voice carried a weight that made David pay closer attention. "What matters is you didn't give up on me when you had every reason to. I had no family, no backup plan, nothing waiting for me except whatever the Army wanted to do with a failed sniper candidate. You gave me a future. I wanted to say thank you while I still could." David heard the finality in those last words, the unspoken acknowledgement that time was not infinite, that chances to express gratitude did not last forever. He nodded slowly, then made a decision that would echo across the next 20 years in ways neither man could predict. "You have plans for dinner?" "No, sir." "Then stay. Meet my daughter. She's 12, learning the rifle, needs to see what good instruction produces." Jake stayed for dinner, then stayed the night, then stayed the weekend. By Monday, he had helped repair the fence line on the south pasture, rebuilt the shooting bench that had rotted through last winter, and taught Maya 3 different ways to estimate range without a rangefinder. By the time he drove back to Fort Benning a week later, something had shifted in the household, some alignment of purpose and understanding that did not require words to be real. Jake returned the following month and the month after that. Sometimes he stayed for days, sometimes just overnight, but each visit added another layer to the foundation being built. David taught them both, not as instructor to students, but as mentor to apprentices, sharing not just techniques, but philosophy, not just skills, but the burden of carrying those skills with honor. On a December evening when Maya was still 12 and Jake had been coming to the ranch for 3 months, David sat them both down at the kitchen table under the yellow lamp. The journal lay between them, closed but present, a physical reminder of all the lessons written in its pages over decades of teaching and learning and teaching again. "I need to tell you something," David said, his voice carrying a weight that made both of them straighten unconsciously. "I'm sick, ALS. The doctors give me 5 years, maybe 10 if I'm lucky." Maya's face went pale, but she did not cry, did not protest, did not ask if the doctors were wrong. She simply reached across the table and took her father's hand, holding it the way he had held hers when she was 4, and watching coyotes hunt across the basin. Jake sat perfectly still, processing the information with the same calm assessment he brought to reading wind, to judging distance, to making decisions under pressure. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and absolute. "Sir, if you're asking me to look out for Maya after you're gone, the answer is yes, I promise." David met the younger man's eyes, seeing in them the same steadiness he had seen on the range, the same refusal to quit when things got hard, the same fundamental decency that made some men into good soldiers and others into great ones. "I'm not asking you to be her father. I'm asking you to be her brother. The kind of brother who shows up when things go bad, who tells the truth even when it hurts, who watches her 6 when she can't watch it herself. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir, I promise." "Say it like an oath, son, because once you give it, there's no taking it back." Jake stood, came to attention as if he were standing before a flag and an officer administering the oath of enlistment, and spoke with a formality that made the words more than words, made them binding in a way that paperwork and signatures could never be. "I, Jake Torres, promise to watch over Maya Cross, to be her brother in all things, to stand with her when she needs standing with, to tell her truth when she needs truth, to protect her when she needs her protecting, for as long as I draw breath. This I swear on my honor as a ranger and a soldier." David nodded once, satisfied, and the 3 of them sat in silence as the lamp burned yellow and the desert wind rattled the windows. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the house, a coyote called to her pups, teaching them to hunt, teaching them to survive, teaching them the lessons that mothers teach when the world is hard and hunger is real. The next 8 years passed in a rhythm of seasons and lessons, of Jake's visits and Maya's growth, of David's slow decline as the disease took muscle control inch by inch, while leaving his mind sharp and his will unbroken. He taught from a wheelchair when he could no longer stand, taught from a bed when he could no longer sit, taught with words when his hands would no longer hold the rifle steady. Maya enlisted at 18 against David's quiet wishes, but with his ultimate blessing, because he understood that some paths chose the person rather than the other way around. She wanted to be infantry first, then armor, then aviation, trying on different futures like clothes that did not quite fit until Jake, now a ranger instructor himself, sat her down and told her the truth. "You're built for distance work," he said. "Your dad knows it. I know it. You know it. Stop fighting what you are." She applied for sniper school 3 weeks later and was accepted 6 months after that. Jake pulled strings to ensure he could attend as an instructor during her cycle, not to give her special treatment, but to ensure she received no special treatment, that her success or failure would be entirely her own. She graduated top of her class with perfect scores on every evaluation, and when the commandant asked if she wanted to stay on as an instructor, she declined politely but firmly. "My father didn't train me to teach. He trained me to protect." The words were an echo of something David had said years earlier, and when Jake heard them secondhand, he smiled despite himself, recognizing the inheritance passing from father to daughter in the most fundamental way possible. David Cross died on a January morning when the desert was locked under rare frost, and the mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. He died in his own bed with Maya on one side and Jake on the other, his journal resting on the blanket near his hand, every page filled with observations and corrections and wisdom accumulated over 30 years of teaching young soldiers how to kill from a distance without losing their humanity in the process. His last words were whispered, barely audible, directed at Jake while Maya stepped out of the room to compose herself before the end came. "You remember your promise?" "Every day, sir." "Then keep it. She's going to need you. More than she knows. More than you know. When it matters most, you'll know what to do." Jake nodded, gripping the older man's hand, feeling the weakness in fingers that had once been capable of holding a rifle steady through wind and heat and the adrenaline surge of combat. "I won't let you down, sir. I swear it." David's eyes closed and his breathing changed, and 15 minutes later, he slipped away so quietly that at first neither Maya nor Jake was certain he had gone. The frost melted by midday, but the cold remained, settling into bones and hearts and memories. The kind of cold that never quite leaves no matter how many years pass or how far you travel from the place it first found you. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with full military honors despite his retirement years earlier, because some debts the Army pays regardless of when they come due. The flag was folded with precision and handed to Maya, who accepted it with the same composure she brought to everything, standing straight and dry-eyed, while inside something fundamental shifted and settled into a new configuration. After the service, after the other mourners had left and the sun had dropped behind the mountains, Jake and Maya sat on the tailgate of his truck, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky over land that would never again hold David Cross, but would forever carry his presence. "He made you promise," Maya said finally, not quite a question. "Yes. What did he make you promise?" "To be your brother, to watch your six, to show up when it matters." Maya took a drink, handed the bottle back, stared at the darkening horizon. "I don't need a brother. I need a spotter." Jake considered this, understanding what she was really saying beneath the words, understanding that she was not dismissing the promise but redirecting it, giving it operational form and function. "I'm too old for Ranger deployment cycles. So transfer to a support role, train new snipers, pull strings the way you did for my school. We both know you can do it. And if I somehow manage to get assigned as your spotter, then you keep your promise by keeping me alive. And I keep mine by keeping you alive. That's how this works." The logic was flawless in its simplicity, and Jake recognized in it the same clear-eyed assessment that made Maya dangerous with a rifle, that made her see through complications to essential truths. He nodded slowly, already planning the phone calls he would need to make, the favors he would need to call in, the strings he would need to pull. "Your dad's journal," he said. "What are you going to do with it?" Maya pulled the leather-bound notebook from her jacket pocket, running her fingers over the worn cover the same way she had watched her father do 1,000 times. "Carry it, learn from it, add to it, pass it on when the time comes." "Pass it on to who?" "Whoever needs it. Whoever's willing to carry the weight of what's written inside." They sat in silence after that, passing the bottle until it was empty, watching stars emerge in the desert sky, while somewhere in the darkness a coyote called and her pups answered, learning the language of survival, learning the lessons that echo across generations when the teaching is true and the student pays attention. 3 months later, through a combination of legitimate channels and creative interpretation of regulation, Jake Torres was reassigned from Fort Benning to a support role with the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, with primary duty as senior marksmanship instructor and secondary duty as spotter for precision engagement teams. The assignment was unusual but not unprecedented, and by the time the paperwork cleared, Maya had completed infantry basic course in Ranger School and was assigned to the same battalion. Their first training rotation together happened on a range in Georgia where the humidity made mirage layers dance and shift, where heat rose in visible columns that required constant recalculation, where the simplest shots became complex because nothing stayed constant long enough to build reliable data. Maya lay prone behind a rifle that had belonged to her father, modified and updated, but still carrying the same serial number that had accompanied David Cross through 3 deployments and 15 years of teaching. Jake lay beside her with a spotting scope, calling wind and distance, watching her breathing, reading her body language the way he had learned to read terrain. The target was a steel plate at 800 yards, barely visible through the shimmer, appearing and disappearing as heat columns crossed the sightline. Maya adjusted elevation, corrected for wind, Let her breathing settle into the rhythm her father had taught before she could read, before she understood what the lessons meant or why they mattered. Send it, Jake said quietly. The rifle spoke once, a sharp crack that echoed across the range and faded into Georgia pines. Downrange, the steel plate rang clear and bright, the sound delayed by distance but unmistakable, confirming what both of them already knew. Jake lifted his eye from the scope and looked at Maya, seeing in her face the same expression David had worn when teaching was going well, when the student was getting it, when the lessons were taking root. Your dad would be proud. Maya did not respond immediately, cycling the bolt, chambering another round, settling back into position with the kind of economy that comes from endless repetition. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the years to a desert afternoon and a coyote hunting for her pups. He taught me to shoot to protect, not to kill. I'm going to honor that, every shot, every time. Even in combat? Especially in combat. That's when it matters most. Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. Understanding that the burden of precision was not just mechanical but moral, that the rifle was both tool and responsibility. That every round sent downrange carried not just physics but intent. They trained together through the summer, through fall, through winter when Georgia cold settled into bones and made fingers stiff, when breath clouds obscured scope glass and had to be managed, when the easy shots of summer became hard and the hard shots became nearly impossible. They learned each other's rhythms and tendencies, learned to communicate in half words and gestures, learned to function as a single unit rather than two individuals occupying the adjacent space. By the time deployment and orders came through in early 2023, they were no longer just sniper and spotter. They were what David had asked Jake to be, what Maya had needed without knowing she needed it. They were family bound, not by blood, but by choice and promise, and shared understanding of what the rifle meant and what it cost to carry it with honor. The deployment brief came on a February morning at Fort Benning, delivered by a colonel whose nameplate read Hayes, whose bearings suggested command experience, whose eyes held the particular weariness that comes from sending young soldiers into places where some would not return. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, Colonel Hayes said, standing before a map that showed terrain features and grid coordinates and colored zones indicating threat levels. Advise and assist mission with Afghan National Army, low-intensity operations, mostly observation and training. Standard rotation, 12 months, return stateside next February. The briefing continued for an hour, covering rules of engagement and communication protocols and medical evacuation procedures, covering all the mechanical details that turn policy into action, that turn intentions into orders, that turn living soldiers into names on casualty reports when things go wrong. Maya sat in the second row, Jake beside her, both of them absorbing information with the focus that comes from knowing that details matter, that the difference between life and death is often buried in subsections of operation orders that most people skim past. When the briefing ended and soldiers filed out talking about what they would do with their last week stateside, Jake pulled Maya aside into an empty classroom, closed the door, and retrieved a small package from his bag. Your father asked me to give you this, after you got deployment orders, before you left. The package was wrapped in brown paper, sealed with tape that had yellowed slightly over the years it had waited. Maya opened it carefully, preserving the wrapping despite knowing she would never keep it, despite knowing that what mattered was inside. Inside was David's journal, but not the one she already carried. This was a second journal, identical in size and binding, but filled with different writing, different lessons, different wisdom accumulated over different years. A note was tucked into the first page, written in David's precise block letters. Maya, if you're reading this, you're deploying. I'm proud of you. I'm also terrified for you. This journal contains every lesson I learned in combat that I couldn't teach at the range. Read it, study it, learn from my mistakes so you don't have to make your own. And remember, the rifle is for protecting, not killing. Choose your shots carefully. Choose your reasons more carefully still. Come home safe. Love, Dad. Maya read the note twice, then opened to the first entry, dated 1993 Somalia, written in the aftermath of Black Hawk Down. The words blurred as her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back and read anyway, absorbing her father's voice from across a decade in an ocean, learning the lessons he had paid for in blood, in sleepless nights, and the weight of watching brothers die while he survived. Jake stood quietly, giving her space, understanding that some moments require solitude even in the presence of others. When she finally closed the journal and looked up, her face had changed, had taken on a harder edge, as if the words inside had added weight that would be carried from this moment forward. He knew, she said. Knew what? That I would deploy, that I would face the same choices he faced. That's why he wrote it. Not for himself, for me. Jake nodded. He always thought 3 moves ahead. Occupational hazard of being a good instructor. And he knew you'd be there. That's why he made you promise. Yes. Maya stood, tucked both journals into her bag, shouldered it with the same precision she brought to everything. Then I guess we'd better not let him down. They deployed 6 weeks later on a March morning when spring had not quite arrived, but winter had finally released its grip, when the world balanced between seasons the way soldiers balance between peace and war, never fully in either, always aware that transition is the natural state of things. The flight from Benin to Kandahar took 2 days with stops and delays in the bureaucratic friction of moving personnel and equipment halfway around the world. Maya slept when she could, read her father's journals when she could not, memorizing passages that spoke to situations she had never faced but might face soon, absorbing wisdom purchased with other people's blood and offered freely to a daughter who would carry it forward. Jake watched her read, seeing David in the way she held the notebook, in the way her lips moved slightly as she processed difficult passages, in the way she closed the journal after each entry and stared at nothing in particular while the words settled into understanding. Firebase Iron Horse squatted on Afghanistan terrain like a temporary wound that would heal once the occupants left, which everyone knew they eventually would. Concrete barriers and sandbags, guard towers and razor wire, all of it built with the understanding that permanence was neither expected nor desired, that the goal was not to stay, but to accomplish the mission and leave. Maya and Jake were assigned to a 12-man Ranger squad led by Staff Sergeant Connor Hayes, no relation to the colonel who had briefed them stateside, but carrying the same weariness in his eyes, the same burden of responsibility for keeping young soldiers alive in a place that specialized in killing them. Connor was 38, which made him ancient by infantry standards, a career NCO who had deployed 6 times and survived by being careful when others were reckless, by planning when others improvised, by understanding that glory got you killed and competence got you home. He had 3 children and a pregnant wife, and he carried their photo in a waterproof sleeve in his left chest pocket, positioned over his heart not for symbolism, but because that was where it fit best. The squad included Corporal Luis Mendoza, 23 years old with a baby face and an infectious laugh that made hard days easier, who told jokes to cover fear and prayed every night before sleep in rapid Spanish that he thought no one else understood, but everyone did. Specialist Terrence Miller, 34, called Doc because he was the squad medic, quiet and competent and haunted by the soldiers he had lost over 4 previous deployments, who checked and rechecked medical supplies obsessively because preparation was the only control he had over outcomes. The others had names and faces and stories, and Maya learned them all in the first week, understanding that when you carry a rifle whose purpose is protecting rather than killing, you need to know who you are protecting, need to understand what their deaths would cost and their survival would preserve. Training rotations filled the first month, establishing patterns and procedures, learning how the squad moved and communicated, learning where Maya and Jake fit into the operational rhythm. They ran patrol routes, cleared mock buildings, practiced immediate action drills until responses became automatic, until thinking was replaced by muscle memory and trust. Connor watched Maya carefully during those first weeks, not with suspicion, but with the assessment of a leader trying to understand a new variable in his equation. He had worked with snipers before, knew their value, knew also that they operated differently, thought differently, saw the battlefield through a scope that compressed distance and made killing impersonal in ways that bothered some soldiers and comforted others. What he saw in Maya did not match his previous experience. She was competent, clearly, with scores that suggested exceptional skill. But there was something else, something in the way she handled the rifle not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Something in the way she chose not to shoot during training exercises when others would have taken the shot. Something in the way she explained her decisions afterward. Target was viable, she said after one exercise where she held fire while enemy role players moved through her sector. but engagement would have revealed position without achieving tactical objective. Better to let them pass and maintain overwatch on the primary route. Connor studied her, processing the logic, recognizing in it a maturity that most snipers took years to develop, if they developed it at all. Who taught you to think that way? My father, Captain David Cross, sniper instructor, Fort Benning. Recognition flickered across Connor's face. I know that name. He taught my sniper school back in '07. Tough bastard, but fair. Made us understand that shooting was the last option, not the first. That was his philosophy. Protect first. Shoot only when protection requires it. And you believe that? Even here, even in combat? Maya met his eyes without hesitation, without defensiveness, with the simple certainty of someone stating facts rather than opinions. Especially here, especially in combat. That's when it matters most. Connor nodded slowly, and something shifted in how he saw her, how he thought about her role in the squad. She was not just a precision shooter to be deployed when targets presented themselves. She was a guardian positioned to watch over brothers who could not watch themselves. 6 months into deployment, the pattern had settled into routine. Patrols followed established routes, engagements were rare and brief. Casualties were light enough that Doc had not lost anyone on Connor's watch. Maya and Jake accompanied missions as overwatch, positioning themselves on high ground while the squad moved below, calling out threats before they materialize, guiding movements through terrain that could hide enemy positions. The Rangers accepted them slowly, the way infantry always accepts outsiders, testing and observing before granting the trust that means everything when bullets start flying. Maya earned respect not through dramatic saves or heroic moments, but through consistency, through being where she needed to be, through making the calls that kept people safe even when keeping them safe meant not shooting. Jake settled into the rhythm of deployment the way veterans settle into familiar patterns, comfortable with discomfort, patient with boredom, alert during the brief moments when alertness mattered. He watched Maya more than he watched the enemy, reading her the way he read wind and mirage, understanding that her state of mind mattered as much as her state of readiness. Late one night when the firebase was quiet except for generator hum and distant radio chatter, Maya sat outside their hooch cleaning her rifle under red light that preserved night vision. Jake found her there, sat down without speaking, began cleaning his own weapon in parallel silence. After a long while, Maya spoke without looking up from her work. Do you think about it? The promise? Every day. Do you regret it? Jake considered the question, running a patch through his rifle barrel, watching the cloth emerge dark with carbon residue. No, keeping promises is what separates us from people who just wear the uniform without understanding what it means. Even if keeping it gets you killed, especially then. What's the point of surviving if you become someone who breaks promises? Maya nodded, accepting this, understanding that they were not discussing abstract philosophy, but operational reality. That deployment was where words became actions and intentions became consequences. He's still teaching me, she said quietly, through the journals, through the lessons he wrote down. Sometimes I read an entry and it's like he's right here telling me exactly what I need to know. That's what good teachers do. They teach in a way that lasts beyond their time. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence after that, both of them finishing their weapons maintenance, both of them staring at the Afghan night sky where stars hung bright and clear, untouched by the complications of human conflict, bearing witness to everything without judging anything. The mission brief came on a December morning, 6 months into their rotation, delivered by Captain Brennan, the battalion intelligence officer. Brennan was 42, former CIA before transferring to regular Army, with the kind of smooth competence that suggested either exceptional ability or exceptional skill at appearing competent. Connor had worked with him before and trusted his assessments, which was why he did not question the brief, even though parts of it felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. Helmand Valley, Brennan said, pointing to a map that showed terrain features Maya recognized from her father's journal, terrain that David had written about years earlier, terrain he had marked as dangerous and advised avoiding. Routine reconnaissance. Verify area is clear for potential forward operating base expansion. Standard patrol, minimal threat, in and out before lunch. Connor studied the map, his experienced eye reading terrain the way Maya read mirage, seeing how the valley curved into a horseshoe formation, how the high ground commanded the low, how any force moving through the valley floor would be exposed and vulnerable. Sir, that's a natural kill box, Request alternate route. Brennan's smile was patient, almost condescending. That assessment is 20 years out of date. Current intelligence shows no hostile activity, no enemy presence, nothing but farmers and goat herders. We need current verification before committing resources to development. With respect, sir, natural terrain doesn't change. A kill box is a kill box, regardless of current intelligence. And with respect, Staff Sergeant, intelligence is my job. Yours is following orders. Unless you have specific information suggesting current threat, the mission stands as briefed. Connor held Brennan's gaze for a long moment, recognizing a fight he could not win, recognizing also that sometimes orders came down regardless of wisdom or caution. He nodded once, accepting the mission despite his reservations. Maya, sitting in the back of the briefing room, opened her father's journal to the entry dated 1997, Operation Copper Ridge, reading words written 26 years earlier about this same valley, this same terrain. The entry was marked in red ink, which David reserved for warnings, for lessons learned through blood and tragedy. Hellman Valley Horseshoe Formation is perfect ambush site, high ground on 3 sides, natural cover for shooters, limited egress for forces trapped inside. Recommend avoid entirely unless absolute tactical necessity. I've forced to enter, ensure thorough reconnaissance of high ground before committing main body. Never assume area is clear based solely on intelligence reports. Trust your eyes, not someone else's assessment. She closed the journal and caught Jake's eye across the room. He saw the concern in her expression, understood without being told that her father's wisdom contradicted current intelligence. When the briefing ended and soldiers filed out, Maya approached Connor with the journal open to the relevant entry. Staff Sergeant, my father worked this area in the 90s. He assessed this valley as high risk. Connor read the entry, comparing David's assessment against the current mission brief. Seeing the contradiction, but also seeing the gap of more than 2 decades between observations. Your father was a good soldier and a better teacher. But that was a long time ago. Situations change. Terrain doesn't. No, but enemy does. And intelligence says there's no enemy currently using this terrain. Maya wanted to argue, wanted to press the point, wanted to convince Connor that her father's assessment carried more weight than Brennan's intelligence summary. But she also understood chain of command, understood that some decisions were made above her pay grade, understood that the time to argue was before orders were given, not after. Jake approached. Connor walked away, reading the situation in Maya's posture. He's not going to change the mission. No, so we go in ready. We assume your father was right and intelligence is wrong. We watch the high ground like our lives depend on it. Because they do. Because they do, Jake agreed. That night, Maya wrote her first entry in her father's journal, adding to the pages he had filled, continuing the record he had started. The words came slowly, chosen carefully, written in the same block letters David had taught her when she was young enough that writing still required concentration. Deploying to Hellman Valley tomorrow despite Dad's warning. Intelligence says clear. Terrain says kill box. We'll trust terrain. We'll watch high ground. We'll protect the squad. Promise made, promise kept, no matter what. She closed the journal, tucked it into her plate carrier where it would rest near her heart, and tried to sleep despite knowing that tomorrow would test everything her father had taught, everything Jake had promised, everything she had trained for across a lifetime of preparation for moments she had hoped would never come. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire a dog barked and other dogs answered, and the sound carried across distance the way sounds carry in desert air, clear and sharp and impossible to ignore. The pre-dawn cold bit through fabric and skin with the kind of persistence that reminded soldiers they were still alive, still feeling, still vulnerable to elements that cared nothing for rank or mission or the promises men made to each other in warmer places. Maya Cross lay prone on the ridge, her father's rifle, an extension of will and discipline, watching the valley below fill with that peculiar gray light that comes just before sunrise, when the world exists in shadow without yet committing today. 600 meters below, 12 Rangers moved in tactical column through terrain that looked innocent in the half-light, but carried the weight of her father's warning like a curse waiting to activate. Connor Hayes walked point, his silhouette recognizable even at distance by the way he moved, economical and careful. A man who understood that staying alive required constant attention to details others missed. Luis Mendoza followed close, his young face invisible at this range, but his nervous energy somehow visible anyway in the way he checked his corners, the way his rifle tracked potential threats that existed only in imagination and training. Jake Torres lay beside Maya, eye pressed to his spotting scope, reading the valley the way David Cross had taught him to read terrain 20 years earlier, seeing not just what was present, but what should be present and was not, what could be present and might be waiting. His breathing stayed steady and controlled, a metronome of calm in the tension building like pressure before a storm. "Something's wrong," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying no farther than Maya's ear, despite the words needing to be shouted, needing to be broadcast to everyone below, needing to stop what was about to happen. Maya felt it too, a wrongness that had no specific source, that came from the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime learning to read situations where being wrong meant dying. The valley was too quiet, too empty, too perfect. Natural landscape did not arrange itself this way, with clear fields of fire from elevated positions, with limited egress routes, with a horseshoe formation that funneled movement into a killing ground as efficiently as any weapon ever designed. "I count 8 primary hide sites," Maya whispered, adjusting her scope's focus, scanning methodically across the high ground that bracketed the valley floor. Natural positions, good concealment, interlocking fires. If I were setting an ambush, I would use every one of them. Jake shifted slightly, verifying her assessment, seeing what she saw and adding details she might have missed. Thermal bloom signatures on the north wall. Could be residual heat from yesterday. Could be someone waiting for enough light to identify targets. "Radio Connor, and tell him what? That we have a bad feeling? That terrain looks dangerous?" He already knows that. Brennan's intelligence brief said clear, and Connor's under orders. Then we watch. We call threats the second they appear. We do what we came to do. Jake nodded, understanding that sometimes the only choice was to be ready for the inevitable, to prepare for the moment when bad feelings became confirmed threats, when intuition hardened into targeting solutions. His hand moved to the radio, keying the frequency that connected them to Connor's squad. "Overwatch to ground. Be advised, multiple viable sniper positions along your route, maintaining continuous observation." Connor's response came back clipped and professional, the voice of a man who had heard warnings before and learned to function despite them. "Copy, Overwatch, proceeding as briefed. Keep us updated." The column continued moving, 12 men trusting that the intelligence briefing was accurate, that the valley was clear, that the mission would be routine despite every instinct and experience suggesting otherwise. Maya tracked them through her scope, watching Connor pause at potential danger points, watching Doc Miller maintain proper interval, watching Luis Mendoza cross himself quickly before stepping into open ground where cover thinned and exposure increased. The world balanced on that edge between night and day, between safety and contact, between the assumption of clear terrain and the reality of what was about to happen. Maya's finger rested along the trigger guard of her rifle, not touching the trigger itself, not yet, but close enough that the transition would take no conscious thought, only the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions that made shooting as natural as breathing. "Maya," Jake's voice carried urgency without volume, the tone of someone who had spotted the thing they feared finding. "North wall, 300 meters from lead element. I have mirage distortion, wrong pattern for natural heat rise." Maya swung her rifle left, acquiring the location, seeing what Jake described. The air above a cluster of rocks shimmered differently than surrounding areas, moved in ways that suggested disruption from below, from breath or body heat or the careful exhalation of someone settling into final firing position. "Confirm," Maya said. "I have the same, likely sniper position, occupied, waiting for—" The valley exploded into violence before she could finish the sentence, before warnings could be issued, before anything could be done except react to catastrophe already in motion. 8 muzzle flashes winked from positions Maya had identified minutes earlier, and 2 Rangers dropped in the first second of contact, falling with the terrible finality of men hit by rounds placed with precision and intent. Luis Mendoza went down first, young and quick and alive one moment, then nothing. His body collapsing into dust without drama or ceremony, just the simple transition from living to dead that happened faster than thought when bullets traveled faster than sound. The crack of the shot arrived after Luis had already fallen, a delayed announcement of murder accomplished with efficiency that spoke to training and discipline and someone who knew exactly what they were doing. PFC Jackson dropped half a second later, not killed but dying, throat torn open by a round that missed his head by inches but found the soft tissue of his neck, severing the carotid in a spray of arterial blood that looked black in the early light. He tried to scream but managed only wet gurgling sounds, hands clutching at the wound while life pumped out between his fingers in rhythm with heartbeats that were already numbered and counting down. The radio frequencies erupted into chaos, voices overlapping and shouting, men reporting contact and calling for help and trying to coordinate response to an ambush that had been designed specifically to prevent coordination. Connor's voice cut through the noise, louder than the others, carrying the authority of a leader who understood that panic killed as surely as bullets. Contact, multiple shooters. All elements find cover and return fire. But there was no cover. Not really. Just shallow depressions and the thin shadow of boulders. Places to hide from direct observation, but not from plunging fire, originating from elevated positions with clear lines of sight to every potential hiding spot. The Rangers scattered anyway, seeking whatever protection the terrain offered, pressing themselves into earth that provided psychological comfort but minimal ballistic protection. Maya's scope tracked across killing zones with mechanical precision, identifying muzzle flashes, reading distances, calculating corrections for wind and angle, and the simple fact that she was shooting downhill at targets who were shooting downhill at brothers who could not shoot back effectively. The math was brutal and clear. 8 shooters with superior position against 10 Rangers trapped in a kill box, with 2 already down and the rest pinned, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to do anything except wait for death or salvation. Maya! Connor's voice over the radio, raw and desperate in ways that professional NCOs never allowed themselves to sound except when professionalism became irrelevant in the face of soldiers dying. Where are they? Her finger moved from trigger guard to trigger, taking up slack, feeling the familiar resistance that marked the point where intention became action, where thought became violence, where protection required killing. She had 8 targets and needed to choose which one died first, which Ranger got saved and which got left to chance, which promise got kept and which got broken by simple mathematics of time and distance. The first target chose itself, a sniper on the north wall, partially visible behind rocks, adjusting his position for a follow-up shot on Connor Hayes, who lay in a shallow depression 30 meters from where Luis Mendoza's body was already cooling. Maya read the geometry of the moment, understood that Connor had 3 children and a pregnant wife, understood that his death would create 4 fatherless kids and a widow, understood that protection meant making this shot count. She let her breathing settle into the pattern her father had taught before she could walk, the pattern that Jake had refined through years of spotting, the pattern that made her body a stable platform and her mind a calculating machine, stripped of everything except the essential task of placing a round exactly where it needed to go. The crosshairs settled on the enemy sniper's head, visible in profile for a fraction of a second as he shifted position, and Maya felt the trigger break with the clean precision of a mechanism built for a single purpose. The rifle spoke once, the recoil pushing into her shoulder like a familiar friend, and 700 meters away, the enemy sniper's head snapped sideways in an ugly jerk that ended with his body going limp against the rocks. The suppressed crack of Maya's shot was swallowed by the ridge in the wind, making the kill nearly silent from the perspective of anyone not directly involved, making it look like the sniper had simply decided to stop shooting and take a nap. First target down, Jake said, already scanning for the next threat, already reading the valley for patterns and priority targets. 7 remaining, Connor's clear for now. On the platoon frequency, someone shouted, "They missed! The sniper missed Hayes!" Another voice, sharper and more experienced, corrected immediately. "No, somebody got him. Somebody's working. Keep your heads down." The word working hung in the air like a benediction, like recognition that someone was fighting back, that the ambush was not completely one-sided, that maybe survival was possible if whoever was working kept working. But Maya barely registered the comment, already transitioning to the next target, already scanning for the next threat that needed eliminating before it eliminated someone she was sworn to protect. The second sniper revealed himself through absence rather than presence, through the way dust fell in a steady trickle from a rock face instead of the random scatter that wind produced. Someone had shifted weight recently, disturbing the equilibrium, and that disturbance marked position as clearly as a muzzle flash. Maya adjusted her scope, corrected for wind that had picked up slightly as the sun began to rise, and waited for confirmation that her target assessment was accurate. The confirmation came as a ripple of fabric visible for half a second when the sniper leaned forward for a clearer shot at Doc Miller, who was trying to reach PFC Jackson despite the young soldier already being beyond help. The fabric was different in texture than the surrounding rock, caught light differently, moved differently, and that difference was enough. Maya corrected half a mil for wind, led the target slightly based on his lean forward, and sent the round. Through her scope, she watched the enemy sniper fold sideways as if someone had cut his strings, watched his rifle drop from nerveless hands to clatter against stone, watched his shooting lane go suddenly and permanently silent. Second target down, Jake confirmed. 6 remaining. Doc still exposed. Below, the murmuring among the Rangers shifted in tone, became less about survival and more about the realization that someone on their side was systematically eliminating threats with a precision that suggested not luck but skill, not accident but deliberate and focused violence applied with surgical intent. Staff Sergeant Connor Hayes pressed into a shallow scrape that barely concealed his outline, turned his head to look up at the ridge where Maya and Jake maintained overwatch. He could not see them at this distance, could not identify who was shooting or how many rounds had been fired, could only observe that enemy snipers were dying in a sequence that suggested coordination and competence. His voice on the radio carried a different quality now, still urgent but no longer desperate, still demanding but now hopeful that demands might actually be met. Overwatch, this is ground. Confirm you have active engagement. Maya keyed her radio while scanning for the third target, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos unfolding below, despite the weight of understanding that every second she delayed was another second for enemy snipers to adjust their fire, to identify her position, to shift from hunting Rangers to hunting the hunter who was killing them. Ground Overwatch confirms, engaging targets as identified, maintain cover and standby. Copy, Overwatch. Engaging targets. Good shooting. Keep it up. The third sniper was smarter than the first two, or perhaps just more experienced. Perhaps a survivor of previous engagements who had learned that the first rule of sniper combat was to avoid patterns, to avoid predictability, to avoid giving away position through the same mistakes that got other snipers killed. Maya scanned his likely position for a full minute without seeing anything definitive, without identifying the telltale signs of human presence in terrain that should be empty. Then she saw the reflection, just a brief kiss of light against glass, a scope catching the rising sun at an angle that betrayed its presence for a fraction of a second before disappearing. The reflection came from a pile of stones on the east wall, 300 meters from Connor's position, 710 meters from Maya's rifle. She calculated distance and elevation and the wind that was now blowing steady at 5 miles per hour from her right, quartering slightly, requiring correction and compensation in the kind of precision that separated good shots from kills. The enemy sniper fired before Maya could settle her crosshairs, and through her peripheral vision, she saw a Ranger flinch as the round split earth inches from his face, spraying him with dirt and rock fragments that drew blood, but did not kill, that reminded everyone watching that proximity to death was not the same as death, but was close enough to make the difference feel arbitrary and terrifying. Maya did not rush. Rushing got people killed, got shots missed, got the wrong target engaged, or the right target engaged at the wrong moment. She waited for the enemy sniper to settle back into position after his shot, waited for him to believe he was still concealed, still safe, still the hunter rather than the hunted. When he shifted slightly to acquire his next target, Maya was already tracking the movement, already applying the corrections her father had drilled into her across a lifetime of training. Her round hit just beneath where the reflection had originated, passing through the narrow gap between stones, finding flesh and bone, and ending the threat with finality that required no confirmation. The enemy sniper's lane went silent. His rifle fell. His presence ceased to matter in the equation of who lived and who died in the Horseshoe Valley that was becoming a graveyard for ambushers who had planned well but had not planned for Maya Cross. 3 down, Jake said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that he did not try to hide, that Maya appreciated despite understanding that satisfaction in killing was dangerous, that taking pride in death was the first step toward losing the moral foundation her father had spent a lifetime building. 5 remaining. They are going to start looking for you soon. Let them look. I will be gone before they find me. But that was bravado talking. The false confidence that came from success, breeding assumptions about future success. And both Maya and Jake knew it. The enemy snipers were good, were trained, were clearly operating under someone's command and coordination. 3 losses would prompt reassessment, would cause them to shift from pure offense to mixed defense, would make them start calculating whether the mission was worth the casualties they were sustaining. On the platoon frequency, the tone had changed completely now. The desperate calls for help had been replaced by something harder to define, something that mixed relief with disbelief, something that sounded like soldiers beginning to understand that maybe they were not all going to die in this valley, that maybe the quiet woman with the rifle who some had dismissed as untested was proving to be exactly what Connor Hayes had recognized her as from the beginning, a guardian, a protector, someone who killed so that others could live. A voice Maya recognized as belonging to one of the younger rangers, someone who had made jokes about female snipers in the chow hall back at Firebase Iron Horse, spoke with a tone stripped of humor and filled with something approaching awe. That is 3 confirmed kills from Overwatch. 3 shots, 3 snipers down. That is not luck. Another ranger, older and more experienced, responded quietly. No, that is not luck. That is Sergeant Cross doing exactly what her father trained her to do. Now shut up and stay down so she can keep doing it. Maya heard the exchange but did not react, did not allow the recognition to affect her focus, did not let pride or satisfaction or anything except the essential task distract from scanning for the 4th target. She found him through patience and pattern recognition, through understanding that snipers, no matter how well trained, eventually betrayed themselves through the simple necessity of breathing and adjusting and maintaining the vigilance that effective Overwatch required. The 4th sniper had positioned himself in dead brush that should have been perfect concealment, that would have been perfect concealment for anyone who did not know how to read mirage and heat shimmer, who did not understand that living things produce thermal signatures different from dead things, who had not spent years learning to see what should not be there by recognizing the absence of what should. Maya watched a shimmer behind the brush, tighter and more focused than the natural heat rise from rocks cooking in the strengthening sun, and understood that someone was breathing there, that someone was alive and waiting and preparing to kill one of her rangers if given the opportunity. She set her crosshairs on the shimmer, corrected for the brush that might deflect her round, added a 1/4 mil for the increasing wind, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure her father had taught and Jake had refined. The brush twitched as the round passed through, then went still in a way that suggested the person behind it had also gone still, had transitioned from living threat to neutralized target, had stopped being a problem that needed solving. The suppressed cracks that had been raking across one section of the valley, pinning down 2 rangers who could neither advance nor retreat, stopped completely. 4 down, Jake confirmed, tracking the valley systematically for remaining threats. 3 active shooters remaining, plus possible reserve elements we have not identified. Maya was already scanning for number 5, her mind running calculations about ammunition remaining, about time elapsed, about how long before the enemy commander, whoever he was, decided that losses were unsustainable and ordered withdrawal or changed tactics in ways that would make her job harder. She had fired 4 rounds, had 8 remaining in her magazine and 4 more magazines in her kit, more than enough for the immediate fight but not infinite, not unlimited, not a resource she could waste through impatience or desperation. The 5th target found her before she found him, or rather, he found her general position and attempted to suppress her with fire that was impressive in its accuracy and terrifying in its implication. 3 rounds impacted the ridge within 10 meters of Maya's position, close enough that she felt the shock of impact through the ground, close enough that rock fragments scattered across her back, close enough that the message was clear and unmistakable. They knew where she was. They were hunting her now. Displacement, Jake said urgently. That was targeting fire, not harassment. They have your position narrowed down. Maya was already moving, sliding backward from the ridge crest, keeping her profile low, using terrain and shadow to break up her outline as she shifted laterally 30 meters and then forward again to a new firing position. The movement took 20 seconds that felt like 20 minutes, 20 seconds during which the Rangers below were exposed and vulnerable, 20 seconds during which an enemy sniper could identify a target and end a life. But when she settled into the new position and brought her scope back up to her eye, she understood why the enemy sniper had chosen to shoot at her instead of continuing to engage the trapped Rangers. He had shifted his priority from mission accomplishment to self-preservation, had recognized that Maya was the greater threat and needed to be eliminated before anything else could happen. The recognition was mutual. Maya spotted him through the way dust bloomed outward from his muzzle brake, a small cloud that hung in the still air for a moment before dissipating, marking his position as clearly as a flag. He was repositioning, moving to a new hide, understanding that staying in one place after shooting was suicide when facing a competent counter-sniper. But movement created opportunity, created moments when concealment degraded, when the necessity of changing position forced exposure, however brief. Maya tracked his movement, reading the pattern, anticipating where he would settle, where he would believe himself safe again. When he paused behind a different cluster of rocks, believing himself concealed, Maya was already on him, already corrected for the new distance and angle, already committed to the shot. Her round took him high in the chest, and through the scope she watched him fold backward, watched his rifle slip from his hands, watched another lane of fire go silent. 5 enemies down, 3 remaining, and the mathematics of the ambush were shifting decisively in favor of the Rangers who had been trapped and terrified and were now beginning to believe that survival was not just possible but probable. On the frequency, Connor Hayes issued orders with the confidence of a leader who understood that momentum had shifted, that the time for pure defense had passed, that opportunity existed for limited offensive action if seized immediately. All elements, prepare to bound to rally point on my mark. Overwatch, cover our movement. Copy. Ground Overwatch has you covered. Move on your call. But before Connor could execute his maneuver, before the Rangers could attempt to extract themselves from the kill box, the radio crackled with a new voice, calm and controlled, and speaking with an accent that was slight but unmistakable, that carried the weight of education and experience, and someone who had done this before in other valleys against other soldiers. You find patterns faster than the file suggested, Sergeant Cross. Every Ranger froze. The voice had come across their frequency, which meant someone had penetrated their communications, had been listening to their traffic, had heard Maya's name, and was using it now with the casual familiarity of someone who knew more than he should, who had prepared more thoroughly than they had anticipated, who was playing a game whose rules only he fully understood. Maya felt ice settle in her stomach, cold and heavy, and wrong in ways that went beyond tactical surprise. That suggested something fundamentally broken in the mission planning, in the intelligence assessment, in the assumption that this valley was anything except exactly what her father had warned it would be. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice professional despite the fear trying to claw its way up her throat. Identify yourself. The response came with what sounded like amusement, with the tone of someone enjoying a performance, of someone who had orchestrated events and was now watching them unfold according to design. You may call me Vance, Marcus Vance. Your father knew me a long time ago. We were students together before I chose a different path. Jake turned to look at Maya, his expression confirming what she already suspected, what the name suggested and the context confirmed. Marcus Vance, the student her father had written about in his journal, the one who had been discharged for killing when killing was not authorized, the one who had disappeared into the shadow world of private military contracts and mercenary work, the one David Cross had prayed his daughter would never meet. My father said you were dangerous, Maya replied, keeping her voice steady, refusing to give Vance the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his words had landed. He also said you were predictable. The laugh that came back was genuine and pleased, the sound of someone recognizing a worthy opponent, of someone who appreciated skill even when that skill was being used against him. Well done. Better than the 6 I have hunted before. Your father taught you well, but he never taught you to face someone who learned from the same teacher. Let us see how long your patterns hold against someone who knows what to look for. The transmission ended, leaving silence that felt heavier than the gunfire had felt, that carried implications more threatening than bullets. Maya understood immediately what Vance was telling her, what the whole ambush had been designed to reveal. This was not a random engagement, not a Taliban ambush, not even a sophisticated enemy operation. This was personal, was targeted, was specifically designed to test her, to challenge her, to force her into a situation where skill would be measured against skill and only one would walk away. Maya. Jake's voice pulled her back from the spiral of implications, grounded her in the immediate tactical reality that required response regardless of larger strategic considerations. We have 3 shooters still active, possibly 4 if Vance is on a rifle. The Rangers need to move now, before enemy reinforcements arrive, or before Vance decides to end this with explosives. I know. And you know he is not just watching anymore. He is hunting you specifically. I know that too. Jake studied her face, reading the determination there, the refusal to be intimidated or distracted, the focus that came from understanding that the mission had not changed even if the context had. Rangers were trapped and needed extraction, enemy snipers were active and needed elimination, and nothing Vance said or did altered those fundamental facts. Your father's journal, Jake said quietly. Did he write about Vance? About how to fight him? Maya closed her eyes briefly, accessing memory of words written 26 years earlier, of her father's assessment of a student who had possessed great skill, but no moral foundation, who had understood how to kill, but not when to kill, who had chosen to use training for profit rather than protection. The entry had been clear and unambiguous in its warning. Dad wrote that Vance thinks tactically but not strategically, wins battles but loses wars, defeats individual opponents but creates enemies everywhere. He said Vance's weakness is pride, is the need to prove himself superior, to demonstrate skill even when demonstration compromises position. Then we use that. We make him prove himself. We make him show us where he is. Maya opened her eyes, understanding immediately what Jake was proposing, recognizing the risk and the necessity in equal measure. If Vance wanted to prove himself superior to David Cross's daughter, he would need to engage directly, would need to take shots that reveal position, would need to sacrifice tactical advantage for the psychological satisfaction of defeating an opponent publicly and decisively. Ground, this is Overwatch, Maya transmitted. Be advised, hostile commander has identified our position and is attempting to engage counter-sniper operations. Recommend you execute bound now, while he is focused on me rather than on you. Connor's response was immediate and decisive. Negative, Overwatch. We do not leave you exposed. We move together or not at all. Staff Sergeant, that is not tactically sound. I do not care about tactically sound right now, Sergeant Cross. I care about not abandoning the person who has kept my squad alive for the last 10 minutes. You are one of us, and we do not leave our own behind. Find those last shooters, eliminate them, and then we all go home together. That is an order. Maya felt something tighten in her chest, something that had nothing to do with fear or tactical calculation, something that recognized, in Connor's words, the same loyalty her father had written about, the same brotherhood that made soldiers fight for each other rather than for causes or countries or anything, except the simple fact that abandoning brothers was unthinkable regardless of logic or survival probability. Copy ground, Wilco. Stand by. She returned her attention to the valley, scanning systematically for the remaining threats, understanding that Vance had made this personal, but that the Rangers pinned below did not care about personal dynamics or historical grievances or anything except surviving long enough to see their families again. She had 3 more snipers to find and eliminate, and then she would deal with Vance in whatever test he believed he was administering. The 6th target revealed himself through impatience or orders, or the simple reality that remaining concealed while accomplishing nothing was tactically pointless. He shifted position to acquire a better angle on the Rangers, who had begun to maneuver in small bounds, and that shift created a ripple in the heat shimmer, a disturbance in the pattern that Maya's trained eye caught immediately. She adjusted her point of aim, corrected for wind that had shifted slightly as the sun climbed higher, and fired without hesitation. The round traveled 700 meters in under a second, covering distance faster than the enemy sniper could process the threat, arriving before any defensive action could be taken. He went down hard, and his lane went silent. 6 down, Jake confirmed, 2 remaining plus Vance. The radio crackled again. Vance's voice returning with approval that felt wrong coming from someone who should be concerned about losing three-quarters of his shooters. Excellent work, Sergeant Cross. You are clearly your father's daughter. But now comes the real test. The last two shooters are not like the others. They are professionals, trained specifically to counter opposing snipers. Let us see if David taught you how to fight equals instead of inferiors. Before Maya could respond, before she could process the implication of Vance's words, the ridge erupted in violence that was both shocking in its intensity and terrifying in its precision. Not rifle fire, not the suppressed cracks of sniper rounds, but the distinctive whoosh and explosion of an RPG impacting rock and detonating with a concussive force that picked up Maya and Jake and threw them backward like toys discarded by a violent child. Maya hit the ground hard, the impact driving air from her lungs, filling her mouth with dust and the taste of blood where she had bitten her tongue. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else, that isolated her in a bubble of silence, punctuated by muffled sounds that her damaged hearing could not quite process. She tried to stand, found her legs unresponsive, tried to orient herself, and discovered that up and down had become suggestions rather than absolutes. Through the dust and smoke and the ringing in her ears, she heard Jake calling her name, or thought she heard it, the sound distant and wrong, like hearing someone shout from underwater. She turned her head, movement requiring conscious effort, and saw him 10 meters away, struggling to rise, his shoulder and chest wet with blood that looked too dark, that suggested arterial damage, that indicated injuries beyond field treatment and requiring immediate medical evacuation that was not coming, that might never come. Maya dragged herself across the ground toward him, ignoring protests from her body, ignoring the voice in her head that screamed about exposure and vulnerability, and the fact that she was completely defenseless while crawling through open terrain. She reached Jake and pulled him behind a boulder, pressing her hands against the wounds, applying pressure that immediately proved inadequate against blood loss that was catastrophic and accelerating. "How bad?" Jake asked, his voice strained but steady, professional even in extremis, even when his life was pumping out onto Afghan rock that would absorb his blood and remember nothing. "Bad. Shrapnel took your shoulder. Looks like lung involvement. I need to seal it." "No time, they are coming." Maya knew he was right, knew that Vance had used the RPG not just to neutralize their position, but to force exactly this choice, this terrible calculus between treating the wounded and defending against threats that were still active, still hunting, still capable of killing everyone in the valley if given the opportunity. She pressed a field dressing against Jake's chest anyway, securing it with tape that she knew would not hold, that would not stop bleeding, that was too severe for anything except surgery and intensive care and luck, that ran out the moment shrapnel tore through tissue that could not regenerate fast enough. "Maya." Jake gripped her wrist with his left hand, the right arm hanging useless, his eyes clear despite pain that should have rendered him incoherent. "Listen to me. You have to leave." "I am not leaving you." "You have to. 10 Rangers down there, 1 dying spotter up here. The math is simple. The math is that you are my brother and I do not abandon family." Jake's grip tightened, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing her to lean close to hear words that cost him everything to speak. 20 years ago, I promised your father I would watch over you, but he also taught me what matters when choices get hard. 10 lives versus 1. Mission versus individual. You know what he would say. Maya did know. She had read those exact words in his journal, had absorbed the philosophy that protection sometimes required sacrifice, that choosing to save one at the cost of many was not protection at all, but selfishness disguised as loyalty. She knew what her father would say, what Jake was saying, what she had to do despite everything inside her screaming that there had to be another way, that she could save both Jake and the Rangers, that refusing to choose was itself a choice and the worst one possible. Tears ran down her face, cutting tracks through dust and blood, and she did not try to hide them or stop them or pretend that the choice was anything except impossible and necessary in equal measure. "I hate this." "I know. Your father hated it too, but he made the hard calls anyway. That is what made him a good soldier and a better man. Now you have to be both." On the radio, Connor's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and desperate and unaware of the conversation happening on the ridge. "Overwatch, we need fire support. Enemy is maneuvering on our position. Maya looked down at Jake, seeing in his eyes the same steadiness she had seen in her father's eyes when he was dying, the same acceptance of sacrifice as necessary cost of protecting others, the same refusal to burden survivors with guilt for making choices that survival required. She pressed her forehead against his helmet, a gesture that held everything she could not say, everything that words would diminish rather than express, everything that 20 years of brotherhood and promise and shared purpose meant. I will send medevac as soon as I am clear. I know you will. Now go. They need you. Maya stood, legs shaking, body protesting, mind screaming that this was wrong, that leaving Jake to die alone was a betrayal of everything she believed, everything her father had taught, everything that made her different from people who killed without counting the cost. But she went anyway, picking up her rifle, checking her ammunition, transitioning back to the role that Rangers pinned below needed her to fill. As she moved toward a new firing position, as she prepared to engage the remaining threats, as she committed herself fully to the mission, despite the cost tearing her apart inside, she heard Jake's voice one last time, weak but clear, carrying across the distance between them, with words that would echo through whatever remained of her life. Tell your father I kept my promise. Tell him I did good. Maya did not respond, could not respond, could only continue moving, continue scanning, continue doing what soldiers do when everything is broken and the mission remains. Below her, Rangers were fighting for their lives. Behind her, Jake Torres was dying to buy them time. And somewhere in the valley, Marcus Vance was waiting to see if David Cross's daughter could pay the price that protection required, if she could make the hard calls, if she could be the guardian her father had trained her to become. The mathematics were clear and brutal. 2 enemy snipers remained active. 1 brother lay bleeding behind her. 10 Rangers pinned below depended on her shooting. The promises made to living men and dead fathers demanded completion regardless of cost. Maya Cross settled into firing position, scope to her eye, heart breaking, trigger finger steady, and prepared to pay in full the debt that protection demanded, the price that promises required, the cost that her father had warned about, and she had finally, terribly, completely understood. The world had narrowed to the circle of glass in front of Maya's eye, to the crosshairs that divided terrain into quadrants of life and death, to the simple mathematics of distance and wind, and the knowledge that every second she hesitated was another second. Jake Torres bled out behind her. Another second the Rangers below remained pinned and vulnerable. Another second closer to the moment when choices became irrelevant because everyone was dead. She forced the thoughts away with the same discipline her father had taught her to use when controlling breathing, when managing heartbeat, when separating emotion from execution so that the rifle became an extension of will rather than a tool held by trembling hands. The 7th sniper was out there somewhere, concealed and patient, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for grief or fear or desperation to compromise the precision that had kept her alive and kept 10 Rangers breathing. Maya scanned systematically, moving her scope in overlapping sectors, reading terrain the way David Cross had taught her to read it, seeing not just what was present, but what was absent, what should be there and was not, what could be there and might be waiting. The sun had climbed higher now, burning away the last shadows of dawn, turning the valley into a furnace where heat shimmer rose in visible columns that distorted distance and made accurate shooting a test of skill and experience rather than simple mechanics. She found him through sound rather than sight, through the distinctive metallic click of a bolt being cycled, of a round being chambered, of a sniper preparing to engage a target he believed was vulnerable. The sound came from her left, from a position she had already scanned twice without seeing anything, from rocks that looked like every other cluster of rocks scattered across the Afghan highlands. But the sound did not lie, could not be faked or disguised, marked position as clearly as a flag. Maya swung her rifle toward the sound, acquiring the location, scanning for visual confirmation of what her ears had already told her. For a long moment she saw nothing, just rock and shadow, and the shimmer of heat rising from stone that had been absorbing sunlight for an hour. Then movement, so slight it might have been imagination, might have been mirage distortion, might have been anything except what it was. A shoulder shifting, a body adjusting position, a sniper who believed himself concealed but had betrayed location through the simple necessity of preparing to shoot. The distance was 690 meters. The wind was gusting now instead of steady, and the target was partially obscured by rocks that would deflect her round if she aimed poorly or calculated incorrectly. Maya did the math in her head, applying corrections her father had written in his journal, using formulas Jake had refined through years of spotting, trusting training, and repetition, and the muscle memory that made shooting as natural as breathing when consciousness stayed out of the way and let the body do what it had been taught. Her round took the seventh sniper in the upper chest, and through her scope she watched him fold backward, watched his rifle slip from nerveless fingers, watched another threat disappear from the board. 7 down, 1 remaining plus Marcus Vance, and the equation was shifting decisively despite Jake bleeding out behind her, despite her own body screaming from the concussion of the RPG blast, despite everything being broken except the mission. 7, she whispered. The word meant for Jake, even though he could not hear her from this distance, even though he might already be beyond hearing anything at all. 1 more, Jake. Just 1 more, and then I send the medevac. Hold on. The radio crackled with Connor Hayes' voice, urgent but controlled, a leader managing chaos through force of will and professional competence. Overwatch ground. We have movement on our position. Multiple contacts advancing from the west. We need fire support now. Maya adjusted her scope, scanning the western approach, seeing what Connor described. Not the remaining sniper, but riflemen, regular infantry moving in tactical bounds, using cover and concealment effectively, clearly trained and coordinated. They were not advancing to engage the Rangers directly, but rather positioning to cut off escape routes, to seal the horseshoe completely, to ensure that everyone in the valley died here regardless of how many snipers Maya eliminated. Ground overwatch. I have visual on advancing infantry, estimate squad strength, professional movement. They are not here to fight, they are here to contain. Can you engage? Maya calculated quickly, understanding what Connor was really asking, understanding that her rifle was designed for precision against individual targets, not suppression against multiple infantry advancing under fire. She could kill some of them, perhaps many of them, but she could not stop them all, could not prevent them from achieving their objective of sealing the valley exits. Negative ground, wrong tool for the mission. You need to break contact now before they complete the encirclement. We cannot move until that last sniper is down. He has the northern route covered and we cannot break his line of sight without exposing the entire squad. Maya understood the tactical picture immediately, understood that Connor was trapped between the infantry advancing from the west and the sniper covering from the north. That movement in either direction meant casualties. That staying in place meant waiting for the noose to tighten until escape became impossible. The 8th sniper was not just a target to be eliminated, but the key piece holding the entire ambush together, the linchpin that needed removing before anything else could happen. Copy ground, stand by, I will find him. But finding him proved harder than finding the others, harder than anything she had faced so far, because the 8th sniper was clearly the best of them, was clearly the professional Vance had mentioned, was someone who understood counter-sniper operations and had positioned himself specifically to be difficult to locate. Maya scanned his likely positions methodically, using every technique her father had taught, every trick Jake had shown her, every lesson purchased with other people's blood and recorded in journals that spanned 3 decades of warfare. Nothing. No movement, no reflection, no thermal signature, no disturbance in the pattern of heat shimmer or the way shadows fell across rock. The sniper had gone to ground completely, had become part of the terrain, had achieved the kind of concealment that only came from extensive training and the understanding that patience was the sniper's greatest weapon after the rifle itself. Maya felt time pressure building like physical weight, felt the knowledge that Jake was dying and Rangers were trapped and infantry was advancing, felt all of it trying to rush her into making a mistake, into shooting at shadows, into revealing her position through impatience or desperation. She forced herself to slow down, to breathe, to remember that her father had taught her to shoot to protect, and that protection sometimes meant waiting, meant trusting that the right moment would come if she remained patient and alert. The moment came not through her own observation, but through Jake's voice on the radio, weak and strained, but still functioning, still fighting despite blood loss that should have rendered him unconscious. Maya, I have him. Northern Ridge, 800 meters, behind the split boulder. I can hear his breathing pattern through my scope. He is waiting for you to shift position. Maya's hands moved before her mind fully processed the words, swinging her rifle toward the location Jake described, acquiring the split boulder, scanning for the target that Jake's trained ear had located through sound alone. And there, barely visible, was the faintest suggestion of shadow that did not match the surrounding terrain. That might have been nothing but might be everything. I do not have visual confirmation, Maya transmitted. I need you to be certain. Jake's response came back immediately, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had spent 20 years learning to trust his senses, who had survived because his assessments were accurate even when they seemed impossible. I am certain he is there. He is waiting. Take the shot. Maya settled her crosshairs on the shadow, corrected for distance and wind, and the uncertainty that came from shooting at a target she could not definitively confirm, trusting Jake's judgment the way she had trusted it through 1,000 training rotations and 6 months of deployment. Her finger took up slack on the trigger, her breathing settled into the familiar rhythm, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, she balanced between faith and doubt, between trust and verification, between the shot that would save 10 Rangers and the shot that might reveal her position to Vance without accomplishing anything. She fired. 800 meters away, behind the split boulder, the shadow moved violently and then went still. A rifle clattered against rock, the sound delayed by distance but unmistakable, confirming what Maya had trusted, what Jake had known, what 20 years of partnership had built between them. The eighth sniper was down. Confirmed kill, Maya transmitted, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her control. All identified shooters neutralized. Ground, you are clear to maneuver. Connor's response carried relief in something else. Something that sounded like respect mixed with disbelief, mixed with the beginning of understanding that the quiet woman with the rifle had just accomplished something extraordinary. Copy, Overwatch. Outstanding shooting. Prepare to displace to rally point for extraction. But before Maya could respond, before she could turn her attention to Jake and the medevac she had promised, the radio crackled again with Marcus Vance's voice. And this time there was no amusement, no casual observation, just cold assessment delivered with the clinical precision of someone evaluating a performance. 8 confirmed kills in 17 minutes. Impressive, Sergeant Cross. Better than your father managed in his entire career, but you made one critical error. Maya felt ice settle in her stomach, understanding immediately what Vance meant. Understanding that the infantry advancing from the west had been a distraction, that the 8th sniper had been bait, that everything up to this moment had been designed to position her exactly where Vance wanted her, exactly where he could control the final engagement. You revealed your pattern, Vance continued. You shoot to protect, which means you prioritize threats based on who they endanger rather than tactical value. You save the family man first, then the medic, then the young soldiers. Predictable, exploitable, fatal. The words landed like physical blows, carrying the weight of truth Maya did not want to acknowledge. The recognition that her father's philosophy of protection first had become a vulnerability that Vance had identified and was now using against her. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice professional despite anger rising hot in her throat. If you want to test me, Vance, stop hiding behind dead men and face me directly. The response came not as words but as action, as the distinctive whoosh of another RPG being launched, not at her position but at Jake's, at the boulder where he lay bleeding and defenseless. Maya watched in horror as the rocket streaked across the valley, watched it close distance, faster than thought, watched it impact rock with a detonation that threw dust and debris high into the Afghan sky. No! The scream tore from Maya's throat before she could stop it, before discipline could reassert control, before anything except raw emotion could find expression. She was on her feet and running before conscious thought engaged, sprinting toward where Jake had been, toward the smoke and dust that obscured everything, toward the place where her brother had kept his promise at the cost of his life. She reached the impact site and dropped to her knees, hands scrabbling through debris and broken rock, searching for Jake's body, finding him partially buried, his face gray with shock and blood loss. His breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. But he was alive, impossibly alive, protected by the boulder he had been lying behind. saved by luck or providence, or the simple fact that RPGs were designed for different purposes than killing individual soldiers in cover. Jake! Maya pulled him from the rubble, checking for new injuries, finding too many to count, understanding that the medevac she had promised was now the only thing standing between Jake Torres and death measured in minutes rather than hours. Stay with me. Help is coming. Jake's eyes opened, focusing on her with difficulty, his hand reaching up to grip her shoulder with strength that should not have been possible given his injuries. Maya, listen. He wants you emotional. He wants you making decisions from fear instead of discipline. Do not give him that. I will not leave you again. You have to. Look behind you. Maya turned, following Jake's gaze, and saw what he had already seen through failing vision and the fog of shock. The Rangers were moving, breaking from their positions, advancing up the slope toward her position. Not retreating to safety, not extracting to the rally point, but moving toward the ridge where she knelt beside Jake, moving toward the danger instead of away from it. Connor Hayes led them, his face set with determination that went beyond tactical calculation, that spoke to something fundamental about who these men were and what they believed about loyalty and brotherhood, and the simple fact that abandoning family was not an option, regardless of orders or survival probability. The radio crackled, Connor's voice formal and absolute. Overwatch ground. We are coming to you. Prepare for link-up in consolidated defense. Negative ground. You need to extract while you can. The mission is accomplished. The shooters are down. You do not need... Connor cut her off, his voice harder than Maya had ever heard it, carrying the authority of a man who had made his decision and would not be argued with. Sergeant Cross, you have spent the last hour keeping my Rangers alive. You think I am going to leave you and Torres up there to die alone? Not happening. We are coming, and that is final. Maya wanted to argue, wanted to explain that they were exposing themselves unnecessarily, that her job was to protect them, and their job was to survive, that everything she had done would be wasted if they died trying to save her. But she also understood that arguing with Connor Hayes when his mind was made up was as futile as arguing with Afghan Win, and that some decisions transcended tactics and became statements about who you were and what you stood for. Copy. Ground, recommend you move fast. Vance has more surprises waiting. Then we will deal with them together. Rangers do not abandon family. The words hit Maya with unexpected force, carrying weight beyond their literal meaning, speaking to something she had not realized she needed until this moment. She was not just the sniper providing overwatch, not just the guardian watching from a distance, not just David Cross's daughter carrying her father's legacy. She was family, was one of them, was someone worth risking death to protect, because that was what Rangers did, what brotherhood meant, what separated soldiers who wore the uniform from warriors who lived its meaning. The Rangers reached her position 3 minutes later, moving in tactical bounds, covering each other, maintaining discipline, despite the urgency driving them uphill toward a position that Vance clearly wanted them to reach. Connor took one look at Jake, saw the extent of his injuries, and immediately began coordinating casualty evacuation with Doc Miller, while the rest of the squad established a defensive perimeter. Doc worked with the focused intensity of someone who had lost too many patients and refused to lose another, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite knowing that Jake's injuries were beyond field treatment, that survival required surgical intervention and luck and time they did not have. But he worked anyway, because giving up was not in his nature, because soldiers did not quit on brothers even when brothers were dying. Maya knelt beside Jake while Doc worked, holding his hand, feeling the weakness in his grip, seeing the acceptance in his eyes. Jake knew he was dying, had known since the first RPG blast, had chosen to keep fighting anyway because that was what promises required, what brotherhood demanded, what 20 years of loyalty to David Cross had built into his fundamental character. You should have extracted, Jake whispered, the words costing him everything to speak. Should have saved yourself. I learned from the best, Maya replied, her voice breaking despite her attempt at control. You taught me that some promises matter more than survival. That family is worth dying for. Your father taught us both. Jake's eyes drifted closed, then opened again with effort. Tell him I kept my word. Tell him his daughter became everything he hoped she would be. You can tell him yourself when you see him, which will not be today. You are going to survive this, Jake. You are going to... The words died in her throat as gunfire erupted from the valley below. Not the precision shots of snipers, but the sustained automatic fire of infantry engaging at close range. The advancing riflemen had reached the Rangers' previous positions and were now climbing toward the ridge, moving to close the trap that Vance had been building since the ambush began. Connor immediately shifted from casualty care to defense, his voice carrying across the perimeter with the calm authority of a leader who understood that panic was the enemy and discipline was the only weapon that mattered when everything was falling apart. All positions, establish fields of fire, and prepare to engage on my command. We hold this ridge until medevac arrives or we run out of ammunition. No retreat, no surrender, no man left behind. The Rangers responded with the efficiency that came from training and trust, each soldier moving to assigned positions, each rifle sector overlapping with others, each man understanding that the next minutes would determine whether they went home in body bags or walked onto helicopters alive. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, trapped on high ground with a dying brother and limited ammunition and an enemy commander who had orchestrated everything to reach exactly this conclusion. But they were Rangers, and Rangers did not quit, did not break, did not abandon brothers, even when abandoning brothers was the only logical choice. They had chosen Maya Cross's family, had chosen to stand with her rather than extract to safety, and now they would live or die together based on decisions already made and commitments already given. Maya found herself torn between staying with Jake and joining the defensive line, between honoring the promise she had made to send medevac and honoring the responsibility she carried to protect the men who had refused to abandon her. The choice was impossible, was unfair, was exactly the kind of decision that destroyed soldiers from the inside even when they survived the outside. Connor made the choice for her, his voice cutting through her paralysis with the authority of command. Cross, we need your rifle. Torres has doc, he has medical care, he has everything we can give him. What he needs now is for you to keep these Rangers alive long enough for the birds to arrive. Can you do that? Maya looked down at Jake, saw him nod slightly, saw him release her hand and gesture toward her rifle, saw him give permission for her to do what needed doing despite the cost to both of them. She stood, retrieved her weapon, moved to a firing position that overlooked the most likely avenue of approach, and settled into the familiar routine of becoming a guardian again, of setting aside personal grief to serve professional necessity. Tell me where to shoot, she said to Connor, her voice steady despite everything breaking inside, despite knowing that every round she fired at advancing infantry was another second not spent with Jake, another moment stolen from the brother who had given 20 years to keeping his promise. Anywhere that keeps them from reaching this ridge, we have maybe 10 minutes before they mass for a coordinated assault. Make them pay for every meter they advance. Maya acquired her first target at 700 meters, an infantry soldier moving too confidently, believing himself beyond effective range of standard rifles, not accounting for a sniper who had been trained by the best instructor the Army had ever produced. Her round took him in the chest, and he went down hard, causing the soldiers behind him to seek cover and reassess their assumption about safe distance. She fired again and again, each shot carefully aimed, each round making advancing soldiers reconsider whether closing with the trapped Rangers was worth the price they were paying. But she was one rifle against many, and while she could slow them, she could not stop them, could not prevent the inevitable moment when numbers overcame skill and the ridge was overrun. Minutes passed in a blur of shooting and reloading, of Doc Miller working frantically on Jake while Connor coordinated defense, and younger Rangers fired with the controlled discipline that training had built but that combat tested. They were holding but barely, and everyone knew that holding was not the same as winning, that eventually ammunition would run low and medevac would either arrive or not arrive, and the outcome would be decided by factors beyond anyone's control. Then the radio crackled one final time, and Marcus Vance's voice returned, but now it carried a different tone, something that sounded almost like respect mixed with the acknowledgement of someone who had tested an opponent and found them worthy. Sergeant Cross, your father would indeed be proud. 8 snipers eliminated, a defensive position held against superior numbers, and loyalty demonstrated that transcends tactical logic. You have proven yourself his daughter in every way that matters. Maya did not respond, did not spare attention for Vance's assessment, focused entirely on the sight picture in her scope and the advancing soldiers who needed stopping before they reached the Rangers who had become her family. Vance continued as if she had responded, his voice carrying across the frequency that everyone could hear, ensuring that his words reached not just Maya but Connor and Doc and every ranger fighting to hold the ridge. But there is one final test, one last choice that will determine whether you truly understand what your father tried to teach you. The infantry stopped advancing, pulled back to positions that suggested orders from above, that indicated Vance had called a halt to the assault. Maya scanned the valley, searching for the trap, for the trick, for whatever final surprise Vance had prepared. She found it in the form of a single figure stepping into view on the valley floor, walking slowly toward the ridge with hands raised, clearly visible, clearly unarmed, clearly offering himself as a target. Marcus Vance. He was older than Maya had imagined, weathered and hard in the way men became hard when they spent decades doing violence for money, when they divorced killing from conscience, and treated death as a professional service to be sold to the highest bidder. But there was also intelligence in his face, competence in his movement, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had been trained by the same instructor who had trained her, who shared a lineage that connected them despite being enemies. He stopped 400 meters from the ridge, well within range of Maya's rifle, completely exposed, making himself an easy target in a way that invited immediate response. His voice on the radio was calm, conversational, the tone of someone explaining a lesson to a student who needed to understand the point being made. This is the choice, Sergeant Cross. I am unarmed, defenseless, offering you a clean shot. Kill me now and the infantry withdraws, the ambush ends. Your rangers extract safely. Or lower your rifle, honor the principle your father died believing. Refuse to shoot an unarmed man and watch me walk away while my forces overrun your position and kill everyone you are trying to protect. Connor's voice cut in immediately, hard and absolute. Cross, take the shot. He is a combatant. He is not protected by surrendering after orchestrating an ambush. This is not murder. This is war. Take the shot. But Maya hesitated, finger on the trigger but not pressing, crosshairs centered on Vance's chest but not firing. Her father's voice echoing in her memory with the lesson he had spent a lifetime teaching. The rifle is for protecting, not killing. Choose your shots carefully. Choose your reasons more carefully still. Every trigger pull is a promise, and some promises should never be made. Vance smiled, seeing her hesitation, understanding exactly what was happening in her mind, recognizing the philosophy that David Cross had taught and that Maya carried like a weight that could not be set down. Your father refused to shoot me in 1997 when I had surrendered after killing an unarmed prisoner. He chose principle over practicality, honor over survival. It cost him his career, cost me my freedom, cost both of us more than either of us could afford. But he never regretted it because he believed that how we fight matters as much as whether we win. That was different, Maya said, her voice tight with the strain of holding back, of not doing what every tactical bone in her body screamed needed doing. You had surrendered, you were a prisoner. And I am unarmed now, offering myself as a target. The question is whether you are your father's daughter or whether you learn that survival sometimes requires compromising the principles that define who you are. Connor's voice rose with urgency. Cross, he is manipulating you. He wants you to hesitate so his forces can regroup. Take the damn shot. Maya's finger tightened on the trigger, applying pressure that was 90% of what was needed, holding at the threshold where the decision was made but not yet executed. 400 meters, no wind, easy shot, target not moving, every advantage a sniper could ask for. One trigger pull and Vance would die and the Rangers would live and the mission would end successfully. But she would also become someone different, would cross a line her father had refused to cross, would prove that his principles had been idealistic fantasies that could not survive contact with reality. She would survive, but she would lose something that survival could not reclaim, would pay a price that living could not justify. Jake's voice on the radio, barely above a whisper, carrying across the distance from where he lay dying. Maya, I do not have much time, so listen carefully. Your father taught us both that how we fight defines us more than whether we win. He was right, but he also taught us that protecting others sometimes requires impossible choices. Vance is not surrendering. He is testing you, and the Rangers need you to pass this test by pulling that trigger. The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, carried Jake's final counsel, his last guidance, his ultimate release of her from the burden of idealism when pragmatism was the only path to survival. He was giving her permission to be what the situation required rather than what her father would have wanted, was telling her that sometimes promises to the living mattered more than promises to the dead. Maya's scope remained steady, her breathing remained controlled, her finger remained on the trigger at the threshold of firing. And in that moment of perfect balance between action and restraint, between killing and mercy, between her father's legacy and her brother's survival, she made her choice. She lowered the rifle. Vance stared up at the ridge, surprise evident even at distance, genuine shock that she had chosen principle over pragmatism, that David Cross's daughter had inherited not just his skill, but his moral foundation, that some lessons survived even when survival suggested they should not. Remarkable, Vance said quietly. You truly are his daughter. Not because you can shoot, but because you know when not to. Then he raised his hand in a gesture that might have been salute or acknowledgement or simple respect, and began walking backward toward his lines, toward the infantry that was waiting for orders, toward whatever came next in an engagement that had been about testing rather than killing, about measuring rather than destroying. Connor exploded. Cross, what are you doing? Take the shot! Take the shot! But Maya kept her rifle lowered, watching Vance withdraw, understanding something that Connor did not, that Vance had revealed through his final test. This had never been about killing Rangers or winning a tactical engagement. This had been about proving that David Cross's philosophy of protection first was either sustainable in combat or was idealistic nonsense that got people killed. Maya refusing to shoot an unarmed and even an enemy commander who deserved death was the answer Vance had come to find. The infantry began withdrawing as Vance reached their lines, pulling back in good order, ending the engagement as abruptly as it had begun. The valley fell silent except for the wind and the labored breathing of Jake Torres and the shocked silence of Rangers, who had just watched their sniper refuse a kill shot that would have ended the fight. Connor crossed to Maya's position, his face dark with anger that was justified and understandable, and completely missing the larger point. You just let him walk away. You just let the man who orchestrated this ambush, who killed Luis and Jackson, who is responsible for Torres dying, walk away because of some principle your father taught you. Explain that decision, Sergeant. Explain it now. Maya met his eyes without flinching, understanding his anger, accepting it as valid, but also knowing that some things could not be explained to people who had not lived them, who had not spent a lifetime learning that how you fight defines who you are in ways that winning or losing never can. Vance was unarmed. He was not an immediate threat. Killing him would have been murder, not combat. My father taught me the difference. I will not dishonor his memory by forgetting it, not even to save my own life. What about their lives? Connor gestured at the Rangers who had stood with her, who had refused to abandon her, who had earned the right to expect that she would do whatever was necessary to keep them alive. What about Torres's life? You chose principle over survival, and if that gunship does not arrive in the next 5 minutes, we all die because you could not pull a trigger. The words landed like physical blows, carrying truth that Maya could not deny, could not defend against, could only absorb and carry forward as part of the cost of being David Cross's daughter. But before she could respond, before she could attempt to justify a decision that was perhaps unjustifiable, the distant thunder of rotor blades cut through the Afghan sky, growing louder, resolving into the unmistakable sound of Apache gunships and medevac helicopters inbound on their position. Connor stared at the approaching aircraft, then back at Maya, his expression shifting from anger to confusion, to the beginning of understanding that perhaps Vance's withdrawal had not been mercy, but calculation. That perhaps the test had been about something larger than one shot or one decision. The gunships swept over the valley in a show of force that scattered the remaining infantry and made pursuit impossible, securing the airspace while the medevac touched down on the ridge in a storm of dust and rotor wash. Doc Miller and 2 Rangers loaded Jake onto a stretcher and ran him to the helicopter, moving with the urgency of men who understood that minutes mattered when dealing with injuries this severe. Maya followed, climbing into the helicopter behind Jake's stretcher, refusing to leave his side even when a crew chief tried to wave her off to make room for more wounded. She knelt beside Jake, holding his hand again, watching Doc and the flight medic work with controlled desperation to stabilize injuries that were beyond stabilization, to save a life that was already slipping away, despite everything they could do. Jake's eyes opened one final time, focusing on Maya with clarity that should not have been possible, with awareness that suggested he had been holding on specifically for this moment, for these final words that needed saying before he could let go. "You chose right," he whispered. "Your father would be proud. I am proud." "Jake, do not." "Tell him I kept my promise. Every day for 20 years. Tell him his daughter is the best of both of us." His hand went slack in hers, his eyes lost focus, and the monitors that had been beeping irregularly went flat with a tone that doctors and medics learned to hate, that marked the transition from fighting for life to acknowledging death, from trying to accepting, from hope to memory. Doc Miller continued compressions anyway, refusing to call it, refusing to give up, working until the flight medic put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head, until the simple fact of death could no longer be denied or fought against or pretended away through force of will and medical training. Maya knelt beside Jake's body as the helicopter lifted off, as Afghanistan fell away beneath them, as the valley where promises had been tested and kept and broken disappeared into distance and dust. She did not cry, did not scream, did not allow the grief that was tearing her apart inside to find external expression. She simply knelt beside the brother who had kept his promise for 20 years, who had died protecting David Cross's daughter, who had given everything so that she could become what her father had trained her to be. The flight to the field hospital took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, 20 minutes during which Maya sat beside Jake's body while Connor and the other rangers sat in silence, each man processing what had happened, what it meant, what it would cost to carry forward. When they landed and Jake's body was transferred to the morgue, when Maya finally stood and walked away from the helicopter, Connor was waiting. He did not speak immediately, just stood with his helmet in his hands, his face showing the exhaustion that came from combat and survival and the weight of leading men through situations where leadership meant making choices between bad and worse. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the anger from the ridge, only a quiet understanding that had been absent before. "I was wrong about what you did. Vance was testing whether your father's principles could survive combat. You proved they could. That matters more than I understood when I was yelling at you." Maya did not respond, could not respond, had nothing left inside except grief and exhaustion and the knowledge that Jake Torres had died believing she had chosen correctly, that her father's legacy had survived because she had honored it despite the cost. Connor continued, his words careful and considered, chosen to acknowledge what needed acknowledging without diminishing what had been lost. "Torres saved us all, not just by spotting that last sniper, but by teaching you to trust the principles your father died believing in. That is a legacy worth honoring. That is a brother worth mourning. That is a ranger worth remembering." The words broke through the control Maya had been maintaining, broke through the discipline that had kept her functional through combat and death and impossible choices. Tears came finally, silently, running down her face while Connor stood witness, offering no comfort because there was no comfort to be offered. Only the shared understanding of warriors who had walked through fire together and survived with scars that would never fully heal. The sun was setting over Afghanistan when Maya finally returned to Firebase Iron Horse, when she walked past the memorial wall where Luis Mendoza and PFC Jackson's names would soon be added, when she entered the hooch she had shared with Jake and found his gear still arranged the way he had left it that morning, still waiting for a return that would never come. She sat on his bunk and opened her father's journal to the first blank page, the page where her own entries would begin, where the lessons she had learned this day would be recorded for whoever came after, for whoever needed to understand what protection cost and what promises required and what it meant to be a soldier who fought with honor even when honor was the hardest choice possible. Her hands shook as she wrote, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as the day poured out onto paper, as Jake's sacrifice found permanent record, as David Cross's legacy continued through a daughter who had proven herself worthy of carrying it forward. Jake Torres died today keeping a promise he made 20 years ago. He protected me so I could protect others. He taught me that principles matter most when they cost everything. He showed me what brotherhood means when the word becomes action. I will carry his memory forward the same way he carried Dad's. Some promises last beyond death. Some debts can only be repaid by living in a way that honors those who died believing we would. Jake believed. Dad believed. I will prove them right. This, I swear. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling her father's presence and Jake's sacrifice and the weight of promises that would shape every decision she made from this moment forward. Outside, the Afghan sun disappeared below the horizon, and darkness came to a land that had witnessed too much death and too little justice, too much sacrifice and too little honor. But on this day, in this place, Maya Cross had proven that honor was possible even in hell, that principles could survive combat, that David Cross's daughter would carry forward the legacy he had built and Jake had protected. One promise at a time, one choice at a time, one shot at a time when shooting was required, and one refusal when shooting would betray everything they had lived for. The night settled over Firebase Iron Horse, quiet and heavy with memory, while somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, warriors slept and dreamed of home, of brothers lost and promises kept, of the terrible cost of being guardians who protected it from a distance and carried the weight of every choice across all the remaining years of their lives. 3 days after Jake Torres died, keeping a 20-year promise, Maya Cross stood in the Firebase chapel staring at a flag-draped transfer case that contained what remained of the man who had been more brother than blood could make possible. The chapel was small and utilitarian, built not for comfort but for necessity, a place where soldiers came to reckon with or fate, or whatever force they believed governed a universe that allowed good men to die while evil men prospered. Connor Hayes stood beside her in dress uniform, his face carrying the weight of command decisions that had put Jake on that ridge, that had resulted in Luis Mendoza and PFC Jackson also lying in transfer cases waiting for flights home that would deliver them to families who would never fully understand how or why their sons and husbands and fathers had died in a valley whose name they could not pronounce for a mission whose purpose they would never know. "The colonel wants to see you," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying in the empty chapel the way voices carry in places built for silence and contemplation. Captain Brennan filed a report, questions about your conduct during the engagement, questions about why you let Vance walk away. Maya did not turn from the transfer case, did not shift her gaze from the flag that represented everything Jake had believed in, everything he had died defending, everything that was supposed to matter more than individual survival or personal grief or the rage building in her chest like pressure that needed release before it destroyed her from inside. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests Brennan thinks you made a tactical error that cost Torres his life. The kind that implies your judgment was compromised by adherence to principles that have no place in combat. The kind that could result in disciplinary action if you cannot provide satisfactory explanation. Now Maya turned, meeting Connor's eyes, seeing in them something that had not been there before the ambush, before Jake's death, before she had chosen principle over pragmatism and watched her brother die as consequence. Respect, understanding, the recognition of someone who had judged her and found his judgment lacking rather than her performance. "Do you think my judgment was compromised?" Connor held her gaze without flinching, without hesitation, with the absolute conviction of someone who had seen combat from every angle and understood that simple answers were for people who had never faced complex choices. "No, I think your judgment was the only thing that kept us all from becoming something we would not be able to live with afterward." Vance was unarmed. Shooting him would have been murder, no matter how much he deserved it. You chose to be a soldier instead of an executioner. That took more courage than pulling the trigger. Tell that to Jake's family. Tell them I chose principle over his life. I will tell them he died protecting you so you could make exactly that choice. I will tell them his death meant something because it allowed you to prove that David Cross's legacy was not idealistic fantasy, but achievable reality. I will tell them the truth, which is that Jake Torres was the best of us and his sacrifice ensured you remain the best of him. The words settled into Maya's chest like ballast, like weight that stabilized rather than crushed, like the acknowledgement she needed to hear from someone who understood what combat cost and what survival required. She nodded once, accepting Connor's assessment, storing it away for the moments that would come later, when doubt crept in and self-recrimination tried to convince her that different choices would have produced different outcomes. "What does the colonel want?" "To hear your explanation before he decides whether to endorse Brennan's recommendation for investigation." To understand why his sniper let an enemy commander escape when one shot would have ended the engagement, to determine if you are a liability or an asset going forward. Maya straightened, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that was pure military bearing, pure professional composure, pure refusal to be broken by questions from people who had not been there, who had not faced the choice, who had not watched their brother die while defending a principle that most soldiers abandoned the first time it became inconvenient. Then I guess I should go explain that some things matter more than winning. Connor almost smiled, a brief quirk of his mouth that suggested appreciation for the statement and the attitude behind it. Want me to come with you, provide corroboration of events? No, this is my decision to defend, my consequence to accept. You have your own after-action reports to file. Already filed. Recommended you for Silver Star, Torres for Medal of Honor. Detailed every shot you made, every ranger you saved, every choice you faced. The colonel has that report. Brennan's objections are going to run into the fact that 10 rangers are breathing because of your shooting and your judgment. Maya felt something tighten in her throat, felt gratitude she could not adequately express mixing with grief. She could not adequately process, felt the weight of Connor's loyalty, adding to the weight of Jake's sacrifice, adding to the weight of her father's legacy, until the total became almost unbearable. Almost, but not quite. Because soldiers learn to carry unbearable weight, learn to function under pressure that should crush them, learn that the only alternative to carrying the weight was setting it down, and some burdens could not be set down without losing everything that made carrying them worthwhile. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Thank me by surviving this meeting and continuing to be the sniper who keeps my rangers alive. That is all the thanks I need. Maya left the chapel and walked across the firebase toward the command building, where Colonel Richard Hayes maintained his office and his authority and his responsibility for everything that happened within his area of operations. The afternoon sun beat down with the kind of heat that made movement feel like wading through invisible resistance, that turned simple walking into work that required conscious effort. She found the colonel in his office reviewing reports, his desk covered with paperwork that represented the administrative burden of command, the endless documentation that turned combat into recordable events in living soldiers into statistical data points. He looked up when she entered, gestured to a chair, waited for her to sit before speaking. Sergeant Cross, thank you for coming. I wanted to discuss the engagement in Helmand Valley before I make any determinations about Captain Brennan's concerns. Maya sat at attention, back straight, hands resting on her knees, presenting the professional bearing that David Cross had drilled into her, alongside marksmanship skills and moral philosophy. Yes, sir, I am prepared to answer any questions. Good, because I have several. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her with the assessing gaze of someone who had commanded soldiers for 30 years and learned to read character in faces and bearing, and the small tells that revealed whether someone was lying or truthful or simply broken beyond repair. Let me start with the most important one. Do you regret your decision not to shoot Marcus Vance when you had the opportunity? The question landed with weight beyond its simple phrasing, carrying implications about judgment and discipline, and whether Maya could be trusted to make hard choices when hard choices were required. She met the colonel's eyes without flinching, without calculating what answer he wanted to hear, without anything except the truth that had cost Jake his life and saved her soul. No, sir, I do not regret it. Even though your spotter died, even though refusing that shot allowed Vance to escape, even though his escape means he remains a threat to other American forces operating in theater, even though all of those things, sir, Vance was unarmed and offering himself as a target specifically to test whether I would compromise my principles when faced with tactical advantage. Shooting him would have been murder, not combat. My father taught me the difference, and I will not dishonor his memory or Corporal Torres' sacrifice by pretending that winning justifies any action we take to achieve it. The colonel's expression did not change, did not reveal whether he agreed or disagreed, whether he understood or dismissed her reasoning. He simply nodded once and moved to his next question with the methodical precision of someone conducting an investigation rather than a conversation. Captain Brennan contends that your adherence to rules of engagement designed for conventional warfare is inappropriate for counterinsurgency operations where the enemy does not respect such limitations. He argues that your refusal to engage Vance demonstrates unsuitability for continued sniper operations. How do you respond? Maya felt anger flash hot in her chest, felt the injustice of Brennan judging her from the safety of the firebase while she had been on the ridge watching Jake bleed out, felt the fundamental wrongness of someone who had not been there presuming to know what choices should have been made. But she forced the anger down, forced her voice to remain calm and professional, forced herself to respond with logic rather than emotion. Sir, with respect to Captain Brennan, rules of engagement exist to ensure we remain soldiers rather than murderers. The moment we abandon those rules because the enemy does not follow them is the moment we become no different than the people we are fighting. Vance was testing whether American soldiers still operate with honor or whether we have descended to his level. I proved we have not. That matters more than any tactical advantage his death would have provided. Some would argue that honor is a luxury we cannot afford when American lives are at stake. And I would argue that American lives are at stake specifically because we maintain standards that separate us from our enemies. The moment we become indistinguishable from them is the moment we lose the moral authority that justifies our presence here. Jake Torres died believing that principle matters. I will not dishonor his death by abandoning it now. The colonel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. You understand that your decision has consequences beyond this engagement. Vance escaped and will continue operating. Other soldiers may die because you chose principle over pragmatism. Can you accept that responsibility? I can accept responsibility for my choices, sir. I cannot accept responsibility for Vance's future actions. He is a war criminal who should be hunted and brought to justice. But justice requires due process, not summary execution. If other soldiers die because Vance remains free, that is a failure of the system to apprehend him, not a failure of my unwillingness to murder him when he was unarmed. Silence settled over the office, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopters taking off from the flight line. The colonel studied Maya for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his thoughts opaque behind professional bearing that revealed nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality. Less interrogator and more mentor, less judge and more fellow soldier who had faced similar choices and understood the weight they carried. Your father was David Cross, sniper instructor at Fort Benning. Yes, sir. I knew him. Served with him in Somalia during Gothic Serpent. He was my sniper on Overwatch when I led a squad into Bakara Market. He saved my life 3 times in one afternoon by refusing shots that would have compromised his position and by taking shots that no one else could make. He was the best I ever saw, and he taught me that being good at killing is less important than knowing when not to kill. Maya felt something shift in her chest, felt the weight of her father's legacy connecting across decades and distance, felt the recognition that she was not alone in carrying principles that most people dismissed as impractical or naive or dangerously idealistic. He never mentioned serving with a Hayes, sir. He would not have. I was a lieutenant then, young and stupid, and convinced that aggression was the answer to every tactical problem. David taught me patience, taught me that sometimes the hardest decision is to hold fire when every instinct screams to shoot, taught me that the rifle is for protecting, not killing, and that understanding the difference is what separates professionals from murderers. The words were so close to David's actual philosophy that Maya had to work to keep her composure, had to force herself not to show the emotion threatening to overwhelm professional bearing. The colonel saw it anyway, saw the recognition and the grief and the pride mixing together in her expression. I read Staff Sergeant Hayes' recommendation for your Silver Star. I read his description of the engagement, the shots you made, the Rangers you saved. 8 confirmed kills in 17 minutes against a coordinated ambush by professional snipers. That is exceptional shooting under extreme pressure. But what impressed me more was his description of your choice to lower your rifle when engaging Vance would have been legally and tactically justified. The colonel stood, retrieved a folder from his desk, opened it to reveal what Maya immediately recognized as an intelligence report marked with classification headers and distribution restrictions. What I am about to tell you is compartmented information that you are not cleared to receive, but circumstances require you to understand the larger picture before we discuss what happens next. He slid the folder across the desk. Maya opened it and began reading, her eyes tracking across paragraphs that detailed an investigation into weapon smuggling, into American arms being diverted to Taliban forces, into a network of corruption that involved contractors and Afghan officials, and according to signals intelligence intercepts, at least one American officer serving in theater. The investigation had been ongoing for 8 months, had collected evidence through multiple sources, had built a case that was approaching the point where arrests and prosecutions could proceed. The name Captain Thomas Brennan appeared 17 times in the report, always in context of meetings with contractors, always in proximity to shipments that subsequently went missing, always positioned in ways that suggested knowledge, if not direct participation. Maya looked up from the report, meeting the colonel's eyes, understanding immediately why he had shown her information she had no clearance to access, understanding that the ambush in Helmand Valley had not been random or opportunistic, but specifically orchestrated to eliminate witnesses who had stumbled onto evidence of the smuggling operation. Brennan set us up. We believe so. The patrol route he briefed was designed to take you through an area where a weapons cache was being staged for transfer. The ambush was meant to eliminate everyone who saw it. What Brennan did not anticipate was that his hired mercenaries would encounter a sniper trained by David Cross. And Vance? Marcus Vance has been working as a contractor for various entities since his discharge in 2004. We have evidence he has been in contact with Brennan for the past 6 months. We believe Brennan hired him specifically for this operation, both for his skills and for his personal connection to your father. Maya felt rage building again, colder this time, more controlled, the kind of anger that did not explode but rather settled into determination that could be channeled and directed and used to accomplish things that hot anger never could. Vance mentioned testing me, mentioned that the ambush was designed to see if David Cross's principles could survive combat. He was not just trying to kill us, he was trying to prove something. And you proved the opposite of what he expected. You demonstrated that principle can survive combat, that honor is not incompatible with effectiveness, that David Cross's legacy was not idealistic fantasy. That was not part of Brennan's plan. Where is Brennan now? The colonel's expression hardened, taking on the quality of someone who had made decisions and accepted consequences and was now prepared to see them through regardless of cost. On a helicopter inbound to this location. He believes he is being recalled for a routine briefing. He does not know that we have sufficient evidence to arrest him, that his communications have been monitored, that his financial records have been subpoenaed, that his associates have been identified and are being rolled up as we speak. You are going to arrest him here. We are going to arrest him here. And you are going to be present when we do so, because you have earned the right to see the man who killed Jake Torres and Luis Mendoza and PFC Jackson face consequences for his actions. Maya closed the folder and slid it back across the desk, processing information that recontextualized everything that had happened in the valley, that transformed a tactical engagement into something larger and more corrupt, that revealed Jake's death as not just combat casualty, but murder arranged by someone wearing the same uniform, someone who had betrayed every oath and principle that soldiers were supposed to embody. What about Vance? Still at large, still operating, but now we know he is connected to Brennan. We can use that connection to locate him. Special Operations Command has been read in on the investigation. They are very interested in having a conversation with Marcus Vance about his activities over the past 20 years. And if they find him, what happens then? The colonel met her eyes with an expression that conveyed more than words could express, that communicated the reality of special operations in a way that official statements never would. Then the question of whether you should have shot him when he was unarmed becomes moot, because professionals who are not bound by your principles will ensure he faces justice one way or another. Maya understood what he was not saying, understood that Vance had sealed his fate the moment he had orchestrated an ambush that killed American soldiers, that the full weight of American military power was now focused on finding him and eliminating him and ensuring that his death served as message to anyone else who believed they could kill Rangers without consequence. I want to be there when Brennan is arrested. I assumed you would. That is why I am telling you this now rather than after the fact. Brennan's helicopter lands in 15 minutes. You should probably clean up and put on a fresh uniform. This is going to be official, and you represent not just yourself, but Jake Torres and every other soldier Brennan betrayed through his actions. Maya stood, came to attention, rendered a salute that was returned with the precision that marked professional soldiers acknowledging mutual respect. She left the colonel's office and returned to her quarters, where she showered away 3 days of sweat and grief and exhaustion, where she put on a fresh uniform that carried the creases Jake had taught her to iron, where she checked her appearance in the mirror and saw her father looking back through eyes that had seen too much but had not broken, that had witnessed death and betrayal but had not lost faith in principles that most people abandoned the first time they became inconvenient. When she returned to the command building 15 minutes later, Connor Hayes was waiting with 3 other Rangers, all of them in fresh uniforms, all of them standing at parade rest in a formation that was not required but was chosen, that communicated solidarity and support and the simple fact that Maya Cross was one of them, and they stood with her when standing mattered. The helicopter carrying Captain Brennan touched down on the landing pad with the usual storm of dust and rotor wash, settling onto concrete that was still stained with Jake's blood from 3 days earlier when he had been loaded onto a different helicopter for a flight he had not survived. Brennan emerged from the aircraft carrying a briefcase and wearing the confident expression of someone who believed he was in control of the situation, who had no idea that control was an illusion that was about to shatter. He saw Maya and the Rangers waiting, and his expression shifted slightly, some calculation passing behind his eyes, some reassessment of circumstances that his intelligence and experience suggested were not routine. But he committed to the facade, walking toward the command building with the bearing of an officer who had nothing to hide and no reason to be concerned about a formation of enlisted soldiers who could not touch him regardless of what they suspected. The colonel emerged from the building flanked by 2 military police officers, their presence formal and official and carrying implications that even Brennan could not miss. His confident stride faltered slightly, his hand tightening on the briefcase, his eyes darting between the colonel and the MPs and the Rangers who had formed up to witness what came next. "Captain Brennan," the colonel said, his voice carrying across the space between them with the authority of command and the weight of judgment. "You are hereby placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft of government property, collaboration with enemy forces, and conduct unbecoming an officer. You will surrender your weapon and submit to restraint. Failure to comply will result in use of force." Brennan's face went white, then red, emotions cycling through shock and anger in the beginning of fear as he realized that the situation was beyond his control, that whatever protections he believed he had were insufficient, that the end he had arranged for Jake and Luis and Jackson was now approaching for him through legal channels that would strip away every defense and every justification. "This is absurd. I demand to speak with my chain of command. I demand legal representation. I demand—" "You will demand nothing," the colonel interrupted, his voice cutting through Brennan's protest like a blade through cloth. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right before you make your situation worse than it already is." The MPs moved forward, one removing Brennan's sidearm from its holster, the other producing flex cuffs and securing Brennan's hands behind his back with the efficient movements of soldiers who had done this before and knew exactly how to handle someone who might resist. Brennan did not resist, seemed to deflate as the reality settled in, as the enormity of what he had done and what would happen next became undeniable. Maya watched without expression, without satisfaction, without anything except the cold acknowledgement that justice was being served, but that justice could not resurrect the dead, could not restore Jake to life, could not undo the damage that Brennan's betrayal had caused to families who would bury sons and husbands without fully understanding why they had died. As the MPs led Brennan toward the detention facility, he turned his head to look at Maya, his eyes meeting hers across the distance that separated them. What he saw there must have been unsettling because his expression shifted again, taking on something that might have been recognition, or might have been fear, or might have been the simple understanding that Maya Cross represented everything he had betrayed, every principle he had abandoned, every oath he had broken. "You should have taken the shot when you had the chance," Brennan said, his voice carrying despite the MPs trying to move him along. "Vance would have killed you eventually. Your principles are going to get you killed." Maya held his gaze, her voice calm and absolute when she responded. "My principles are the only thing that separate me from people like you. I would rather die with them than live without them." Jake Torres understood that. My father understood that. You will never understand it because you sold your honor for money and your soul for survival, and now you have neither. The MPs pulled Brennan away before he could respond, before he could offer justifications or excuses or anything, except the silence that guilty men learn to embrace when words can only make things worse. The Rangers maintained formation until Brennan was out of sight. Then Connor dismissed them with a gesture and approached Maya. "How do you feel?" Maya considered the question, examining her emotional state with the same methodical attention she brought to reading wind or calculating wreckage. Empty. Brennan being arrested does not bring Jake back, does not restore Luis or Jackson, does not change anything except that one guilty man will face consequences. It changes more than you think. It proves that betrayal has costs, that corruption does not go unpunished, that soldiers who die serving their country are not forgotten or dismissed or swept aside when investigating their deaths becomes inconvenient. Jake's death meant something because it exposed Brennan. That matters. Does it matter enough? Connor did not answer immediately, understanding that the question was not really about Brennan or justice or consequences, but about whether anything could ever matter enough to justify the cost that combat extracted from soldiers who survived. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and chosen to acknowledge the question without pretending there was a satisfactory answer. "No, nothing matters enough, but we do it anyway because the alternative is giving up, and giving up means everyone who died did so for nothing. Jake would not want that. Your father would not want that. They would want you to keep going, keep fighting, keep being the guardian they trained you to become." Maya nodded, accepting the truth in Connor's words, even if acceptance did not make carrying the weight any easier. She turned to leave to return to her quarters where Jake's gear still waited to be packed and shipped home along with his body, where the silence would be broken only by memories of conversations that would never be continued and promises that had been kept at the highest possible cost. But before she could take more than a few steps, the colonel's voice called her back. "Sergeant Cross, one more thing. We have received intelligence that Marcus Vance has been located. Special Operations is planning a direct action mission to apprehend or eliminate him within the next 72 hours. They have requested that a sniper familiar with Vance's tactics and methods provide overwatch for the operation." Maya turned back, understanding immediately what the colonel was offering, what opportunity was being presented, what choice was being placed before her. She could volunteer for the mission, could be present when Vance was finally brought to account for his actions, could have the closure that came from seeing the man who had killed Jake face consequences for his decisions. But she could also decline, could choose to let other soldiers handle the mission, could avoid putting herself in position where she might face the same choice again, where Vance might test her principles one more time, and she might have to choose between shooting and honoring the standards her father had died believing in. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I respectfully decline. Vance tested me once and I proved what needed proving. I do not need to prove it again, and I do not need to be present when he faces justice. Let the professionals handle it." The colonel studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what looked like approval. "Very well, I will inform Special Operations that you are unavailable for the mission. For what it is worth, I think you are making the right choice. Some debts do not require personal settlement. Some justice is better served by institutions rather than individuals." "Yes, sir. Is there anything else?" "Yes, your deployment is complete. You are being reassigned stateside for instructor duty at Fort Benning. The Army needs snipers who understand that shooting is only part of the job, that the harder part is knowing when not to shoot. Your father taught a generation of snipers that lesson. Now you will teach the next generation." The assignment landed with weight that Maya had not anticipated, carrying implications about the future and purpose, and the recognition that her combat deployment was ending not in disgrace or dismissal, but in the acknowledgement that her skills and judgment were valuable enough to be passed forward to soldiers who would face the same choices she had faced. "When do I leave?" 2 weeks. That gives you time to attend the memorial service for Torres and the others, time to process what happened, time to prepare for the transition back to a world where people are not trying to kill you on a daily basis. Maya saluted, the colonel returned it, and she walked away from the command building toward a future that would be shaped by the past 3 days, by Jake's sacrifice, by her choice not to shoot Vance, by the understanding that some principles mattered more than winning, and some promises lasted beyond death, and some debts could only be repaid by living in ways that honored those who had died, believing that honor was possible, even in hell. The sun was setting over Afghanistan again, painting the sky in colors that were beautiful despite the ugliness of what happened beneath them, creating visual poetry in a land where poetry was written in blood and loss, and the stubborn refusal of soldiers to abandon principles even when abandoning them would make survival easier. Maya returned to her quarters and began the process of packing Jake's belongings, sorting through gear that he would never use again, finding small personal items that revealed the man behind the soldier. A photo of Jake and David Cross at the ranch, both smiling, both holding rifles, both representing the best of what soldiers could be when training was combined with character and skill was married to purpose. A letter addressed to Maya, sealed and marked, "Open if I do not make it back." She opened it with shaking hands, unfolding paper that carried Jake's handwriting, Jake's voice, Jake's final words to the sister he had protected for 20 years. The letter was short, direct, pure Jake in every word and phrase and sentiment expressed. "Maya, if you are reading this, I kept my promise to your father. I watched over you. I stood with you. I protected you when you needed protecting. I do not regret a single moment of the past 20 years. You have become everything David hoped you would be, and more than I ever imagined when I first showed up at that ranch as a lost kid looking for purpose. You gave me family when I had none. You gave me a mission when I was adrift. You gave me a reason to be better than I was. For that, I will be eternally grateful. Keep your father's legacy alive. Keep his principles in your heart. Keep fighting the good fight in the way only you can fight it. And know that I died proud to have been your brother, proud to have kept my promise, proud to have been part of something larger than myself. Tell David I did good. Tell him his daughter is the best of both of us. Tell him the promise was kept. All my love, Jake." Maya read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, grief pouring out in a way it had not since Jake died, releasing the pressure that had been building behind professional composure and military bearing, and the necessity of staying functional when everything inside was breaking. She cried for Jake, for Luis, for Jackson, for all the soldiers who died believing that their sacrifices mattered and their deaths would mean something, and the people they protected would remember them with honor. She cried for her father, who had taught principles that cost his daughter her brother, but had saved her soul. She cried for herself, for the weight she would carry forward, for the memories that would never fade and the choices that would never stop haunting quiet moments when discipline relaxed and grief found expression. When the tears finally stopped, when the crying had run its course and left her empty, but somehow lighter, Maya folded the letter and placed it in her father's journal alongside the entry she had written about Jake's death. The journal was filling up with lessons and loss, with wisdom purchased through other people's blood, with the accumulated weight of serving as guardian, and the cost that protection extracted from those who took the responsibility seriously. She added one more entry, written in the same block letters her father had used, continuing the record that would outlive her and be passed forward to whoever needed it next. "Brennan arrested today. Justice served, but it feels hollow. Jake is still dead. Luis and Jackson are still gone. The principle was upheld, but the cost was everything. I do not know if I made the right choice when I lowered my rifle. I know only that it was the choice Dad would have made, the choice Jake supported, the choice that allows me to look in the mirror without seeing a murderer looking back. Some debts can only be repaid by living with honor. Some promises can only be kept by refusing to compromise when compromise would be easier. I will keep fighting. I will keep protecting. I will keep being the guardian Dad trained me to become, and Jake died protecting. This I swear on both their graves." She closed the journal and stood, walked to the window where she could see the memorial wall being updated with new names, where Jake's name would soon join the list of soldiers who had given everything in service to principles that most people took for granted or dismissed as naive idealism, unsuited for the real world. But Maya knew better, knew that the real world was built by people who refused to compromise principles when compromise was expedient, who chose honor over survival when survival would cost their souls, who understood that some things mattered more than winning and some victories were worthless if achieving them required becoming the enemy. 3 days after Jake Torres died, keeping a 20-year promise, Maya Cross understood finally and completely what her father had tried to teach, what Jake had demonstrated through his death, what being a warrior with honor required when honor was tested by circumstances designed to break it. She would carry that understanding forward to Fort Benning, where she would teach the next generation of snipers not just how to shoot, but when not to shoot, not just how to kill, but how to live with killing, not just how to survive, but how to survive with their humanity intact. The sun finished setting over Afghanistan, darkness settled over Firebase Iron Horse, and Maya Cross stood in the window watching nightfall over a land that had taught her lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. Lessons purchased with her brother's blood and her father's legacy, and the understanding that some promises lasted beyond death, and some debts could never be fully repaid but had to be honored anyway. Tomorrow she would attend the memorial service. Next week she would escort Jake's body home. In 2 weeks she would leave Afghanistan behind and begin the next chapter of a life shaped by sacrifice and defined by principles that had survived their ultimate test. But tonight she stood in silence, honoring the dead, acknowledging the question, accepting the weight that guardians carried when they took their responsibility seriously and refused to set it down no matter how heavy it became. Some promises were kept through action, some through sacrifice, some through the simple refusal to abandon principles when abandoning them would make everything easier. Maya Cross had kept all three kinds, and though the cost had been devastating, though the price had been paid in blood and brotherhood and a grief that would never fully heal, she knew with absolute certainty that Jake Torres and David Cross would have been proud of the warrior their teaching and sacrifice had created. That knowledge would have to be enough, because it was all she had left to carry forward into a future built on the foundation of their deaths and her determination to ensure those deaths meant something more than just names on a wall and memories that faded with time. The promise had been kept. The debt had been acknowledged. The reckoning had come for those who had betrayed their oaths. And now the work of living with the consequences could begin. The memorial service was held on a morning when the Afghan sky stretched endless in blue, indifferent to the grief assembled beneath it, unconcerned with the ceremonies humans conducted to make sense of death that made no sense, to find meaning in loss that defied meaning. 3 transfer cases stood draped in flags, each one containing what remained of a soldier who had walked into Helmand Valley breathing and returned as cargo, transformed from living men into honored dead through the simple mathematics of combat, where protection was attempted but not guaranteed. Maya Cross stood in dress uniform among the assembled rangers, her face composed but her chest tight with grief that had no outlet except the formal rituals that military tradition provided for acknowledging sacrifice. Connor Hayes stood beside her, his 3 children back home, unaware of how close they had come to growing up fatherless, unaware that the woman standing silent beside their father had killed 8 men to ensure they would know him beyond childhood memories. The chaplain spoke words that were meant to comfort but could not, that were meant to explain but only highlighted the inexplicable, that were meant to provide closure, but only emphasized how closure was impossible when the dead took pieces of the living with them into whatever waited beyond the final breath. Maya heard the words without processing them, standing at attention while her mind wandered to a Nevada ranch where her father had taught her to shoot and Jake had promised to watch over her, and both of them had believed that honor was possible, even in a profession built on violence. When the chaplain finished and the rifles fired their salute and the bugler played taps with notes that hung in the Afghan air like questions that would never be answered, Maya stepped forward to receive the flag that had covered Jake Torres' transfer case. The colonel who had served with her father performed the ceremony with precise movements that came from decades of practice, folding the flag into the triangle that represented everything soldiers died defending, presenting it to Maya with words that she had heard before, but that landed differently when the flag represented her brother. On behalf of a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Maya accepted the flag, feeling its weight in her hands, understanding that what she held was not cloth, but responsibility, not symbol but promise, not memorial but mandate to ensure that Jake's death meant something beyond the simple fact of his absence. She held the flag against her chest and returned to formation, standing through the rest of the ceremony, while Luis Mendoza's mother accepted her son's flag with tears streaming down her face, and PFC Jackson's young widow held their infant daughter with one arm and received the flag with the other. After the ceremony ended and the families departed and the transfer cases were loaded onto aircraft for their final journey home, Connor approached Maya with the hesitant bearing of someone who had something to say, but was uncertain how it would be received. The squad wants to do something for Torres, something beyond the official memorial. Maya turned to face him, reading the sincerity in his expression, understanding that the Rangers who had refused to abandon her on the ridge wanted to honor the man who had made that refusal possible through his sacrifice. What kind of something? We want to name our sniper position after him, Torres Ridge. Make it official in our unit history. Ensure that everyone who comes after knows that Jake Torres died protecting Rangers and that we do not forget debts like that. The gesture landed with weight that Maya had not anticipated, carrying significance beyond its simple expression, communicating that Jake had become part of the unit's identity, that his sacrifice had been integrated into their collective memory in ways that would outlast individual soldiers and persist across generations of Rangers who would serve in positions Jake had helped secure. He would have liked that. He never wanted recognition, but he understood that memory matters, that the dead live on through the living, choosing to remember them. Connor nodded, then hesitated before continuing. There is something else, something the squad discussed and voted on unanimously. We want you to know that you are one of us, not because you are a sniper attached to our unit, but because you are family. You stood with us when you could have extracted. You protected us when protecting us cost you everything. You made choices that most people would not have the courage to make. That matters more than rank or assignment or anything except the simple fact that Rangers take care of family, and you are family now. Maya felt emotion threaten to overwhelm the composure she had maintained through the memorial service, felt gratitude mixing with grief, mixing with the recognition that she had found brotherhood in a place she had expected only professional respect. She nodded once, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she attempted words, letting the gesture communicate what speech could not. Connor understood. He gripped her shoulder briefly, the kind of contact that soldiers used when words were insufficient, when simple human connections said more than elaborate statements ever could. Then he returned to the other Rangers who were waiting, who raised their hands in salute, not to rank, but to recognition, not to authority, but to respect earned through action and sacrifice, and the refusal to compromise principles when compromise would have made survival easier. Maya returned the salute, then turned and walked back to her quarters where the work of preparing for departure waited. She had 48 hours remaining in Afghanistan before the flight that would take her first to Germany for debriefing, then to Dover Air Force Base, where Jake's body would be received with full honors, then finally to Fort Benning, where she would begin the next chapter of a life shaped by loss and defined by the determination to ensure that loss meant something. The 48 hours passed in a blur of administrative tasks and final preparations, of paperwork that reduced combat and death to bureaucratic documentation, of equipment, turn-in and medical screening, and the countless small rituals that marked the transition from deployment to home. Maya moved through it all with mechanical efficiency, her mind already halfway across the world to places and purposes that waited beyond the wire and the walls and the weight of Afghanistan, pressing down on everything that happened here. On her final evening at Firebase Iron Horse, she walked to the memorial wall where Jake's name had been added, alongside Luis Mendoza and PFC Jackson, and the dozens of other soldiers who had died in this rotation serving purposes they believed in, even when those purposes were unclear or compromised or corrupted by people like Brennan, who wore uniforms without embodying the values those uniforms represented. She stood before Jake's name for a long time, one hand resting on the plaque, feeling the metal warm from the sun, reading the inscription that reduced a life to dates and rank, and the simple acknowledgement of service rendered and sacrifice made. It was inadequate, as all such memorials were inadequate, but it was also necessary because memory required physical anchoring, required something tangible that people could visit and touch and use as focus for grief that had no natural endpoint. I kept my promise, Maya said quietly, speaking to the wall but meaning the words for Jake wherever he was, whatever waited beyond death for men who had lived with honor and died protecting others. I did not compromise. I did not become someone you and Dad would not recognize. I paid the price, but I kept the promise. I hope that matters. I hope you can rest knowing it mattered. The wall did not answer, offered no sign that Jake heard or acknowledged or cared, but Maya had not expected response. The words were for her as much as for him, were the formal acknowledgement that a chapter was closing, that Afghanistan was ending, that the next phase required different skills and different challenges and the same unwavering commitment to principles that had defined everything that came before. She returned to her quarters and retrieved her father's journal, now heavy with entries that documented 3 generations of soldiers learning what it cost to be guardians, what it required to carry rifles with purpose beyond simply killing whoever needed killing. She opened to a blank page and wrote the entry that would mark this transition, that would serve as bridge between deployment and instruction, between being protected and becoming protector of those who would face choices she had faced. Leaving Afghanistan tomorrow. Jake is coming home in a transfer case. Luis and Jackson are too. Brennan is in custody awaiting trial. Vance is still alive but being hunted. The mission is complete but feels unfinished because the dead are still dead and justice cannot resurrect them. I am being assigned to Fort Benning where Dad taught and where Jake learned and where I will now teach the next generation what they taught me. The circle continues, the promise is passed forward. The weight is carried because carrying it is the only way to honor those who carried it before us. Some debts can never be repaid, only acknowledged and respected and used as foundation for building something that outlasts individual soldiers and persists across generations who never knew the names but benefit from the sacrifices. This is that debt. This is that foundation. This is the promise I will keep until I can pass it forward to someone else who understands what it costs and chooses to pay anyway. She closed the journal and packed it carefully in her duffel alongside the flag that had draped Jake's transfer case and the letter he had written knowing he might not survive, and the photo of him and her father at the ranch where everything had started, and where, in some ways, everything would continue, even though the men in the photo were both gone. The flight to Germany was long and uncomfortable, filled with soldiers who talked too loud or slept too deeply, or sat in silence processing experiences that would take years to fully understand, and longer still to integrate into lives that would never quite return to what they had been before. Deployment taught them things about themselves and the world that could not be unlearned. Maya sat in silence, watching Afghanistan disappear beneath clouds and distance, feeling the weight of leaving mixed with the relief of surviving, mixed with the guilt that always came when soldiers went home, while others went home in boxes. Germany was a blur of debriefing and processing, of intelligence officers who wanted to know everything about the ambush and Vance's tactics and Brennan's betrayal, of psychologists who wanted to assess her mental state and determine if she needed intervention or could transition to instructor duty without the risk of breaking down in front of students who needed confidence and competence rather than trauma and uncertainty. Maya answered their questions with professional detachment, providing information without emotion, describing events without editorializing, making it clear that she understood what had happened and had processed it sufficiently to function in roles that required stability and judgment. The psychologist seemed satisfied, or at least unwilling to prevent her assignment based on assessments that were necessarily incomplete and provisional. Then Dover, where Jake's transfer case was unloaded with a ceremony that honored every fallen soldier who returned through the port that existed specifically to receive America's dead and ensure they came home with dignity. Maya stood in dress uniform again, watching the honor guard carry Jake down the aircraft ramp, watching the salutes and the precision and the careful choreography that military tradition had developed for acknowledging sacrifice while managing grief. Jake's family was there, his mother who he had barely known, and aunts and uncles who had stayed in contact despite his being raised in foster care, all of them gathering to claim a soldier they had not fully known in life, but who belonged to them in death through the simple fact of blood and birth. Maya introduced herself, explained that Jake had been her brother in all the ways that mattered, that he had died protecting her and had asked that she tell his family he had found purpose and belonging and had served with honor. The family received this with gratitude mixed with confusion, with appreciation for the sentiment but uncertainty about the woman who claimed brotherhood with someone they had lost contact with years earlier. Maya understood their reaction, did not try to explain what could not be explained to people who had not lived it, simply offered condolences and stepped back to let them grieve in their own way while she grieved in hers. The burial was scheduled for Arlington National Cemetery, where Jake would rest among warriors who had likewise served and sacrificed, where his grave would be tended and his name would be recorded and his memory would persist as long as the nation he had defended continued to honor those who had made its survival possible. Maya would attend when it happened, would stand graveside and render final honors. But for now, she had to continue to Fort Benning, where duty waited and students needed instruction, and the work of passing forward what Jake and her father had taught could begin. Fort Benning, Georgia welcomed her with heat and humidity that was different from Afghanistan's dry furnace, but no less oppressive, that made movement feel like swimming through invisible resistance, that reminded her that home was not always comfortable or easy or anything except familiar in ways that deployment never was. The sniper school occupied ground that her father had walked for 15 years, buildings he had taught in, ranges he had refined, traditions he had helped establish through dedication to excellence, and refusal to accept mediocrity in students who would carry rifles with the power to kill at distances where mistakes could not be corrected. Maya reported to the school commandant, a lieutenant colonel named Pierce, who had known David Cross and had specifically requested Maya's assignment based on recommendations from Colonel Hayes and the after-action reports that detailed her performance in Helmand Valley. Pierce was 52, weathered and direct, with the bearing of someone who had spent a career in special operations and had learned that reputation mattered less than results, and results came from training that was realistic and demanding and uncompromising in its standards. Sergeant Cross, welcome to Sniper School. Your father was one of the best instructors we ever had, and from what I am reading in your file, you have inherited his skills and his judgment. We need both. The students coming through here are going to deploy to places where they will face choices your father faced and you faced. They need to understand that being a sniper is not just about shooting straight. It is about shooting with purpose and living with the consequences and knowing that every round fired carries moral weight that cannot be ignored or dismissed. Maya stood at attention, absorbing the assignment and the expectations and the recognition that she was being entrusted with shaping the next generation of soldiers who would carry her father's legacy forward, whether they knew his name or not. Yes, sir, I understand their responsibility. Good, because I am assigning you to advanced ethics instruction. Most of our instructors can teach marksmanship and fieldcraft and tactics, but teaching students when not to shoot, teaching them that some targets are not legitimate regardless of tactical value, teaching them that honor matters even when dishonor would be expedient. That requires someone who has faced the choice and made the hard call. You have done that, now you will teach others to do the same. The assignment was both validation and burden, both recognition of what she had accomplished and acknowledgement of what it had cost. Maya accepted it the way soldiers accepted difficult assignments, with professional composure that masked the emotional complexity beneath. Yes, sir. When do I start? Next week. That gives you time to settle in, to observe current instruction, to prepare your curriculum. Your father left detailed lesson plans that we still use. You might want to review them, see if they need updating based on your recent experience. Maya was dismissed and shown to her quarters, a small room in instructor housing that was identical to 1,000 other military quarters she had occupied over the years. She unpacked her belongings, hanging uniforms and arranging gear, and placing the photo of Jake and her father on the small desk where it could serve as reminder and inspiration and silent witness to the work she would do in their names. That evening, she walked to the ranges where her father had taught and she had learned, where Jake had transformed from skeptical student to trusted brother, where thousands of soldiers had learned skills that kept them alive and kept others alive when circumstances required someone who could shoot accurately from distances where most people could not identify targets, much less hit them. The ranges were empty now, quiet in the failing light, waiting for tomorrow's students to arrive and begin the process of transformation from regular infantry to precision shooters. Maya stood at the firing line and looked downrange toward targets that stood at distances her father had considered essential for sniper qualification. 800 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,200 meters, each one representing not just range but complexity, not just distance but the accumulation of variables that made shooting at extended range an exercise in physics and mathematics and the ability to read environmental conditions that were constantly changing. She thought about the 8 snipers she had killed in Helmand Valley, about the fact that each one had stood at ranges like these and learned skills similar to hers, had been taught by instructors who believed in what they were teaching, had practiced until repetition became reflex and mechanics became instinct. The difference between her and them had not been skill or training or natural ability. The difference had been purpose, had been the understanding that the rifle was for protecting rather than simply killing, that choosing targets required moral judgment beyond tactical assessment. That was what she would teach here. That was what her father had taught and Jake had embodied, and she had proven in the moment when lowering her rifle had cost more than pulling the trigger, but had preserved something that shooting Vance would have destroyed forever. The weeks passed in the rhythm of instruction and evaluation, of students arriving eager and uncertain and leaving confident and competent, of Maya finding her voice as a teacher and discovering that explaining what her father and Jake had taught was different from living it, but no less important. She taught marksmanship fundamentals and fieldcraft techniques, taught range estimation and wind reading, taught all the mechanical skills that made snipers effective at their primary function. But she also taught the harder lessons, the ones that had no simple answers, the ones that required students to think about consequences beyond immediate tactical success. She taught them about the weight of killing, about the fact that every person in their crosshairs was someone's son or brother or father, about the necessity of ensuring that every shot was justified not just legally but morally, that following rules of engagement was not enough if following them meant betraying the principles that made them soldiers rather than murderers. Some students understood immediately, brought their own experiences and observations to discussions that explored the ethics of precision shooting. Others struggled, pushed back against what they perceived as unnecessary complication of simple mechanical tasks, argued that war was war and killing was killing, and attempting to impose moral constraints on combat was naive idealism that got soldiers killed. Maya did not argue with them, did not try to force acceptance of principles they were not ready to embrace. She simply told her story, described the choice she had faced and the decision she had made and the cost that decision had extracted. She told them about Jake Torres, who had died protecting her right to make that choice, about her father who had taught her that how you fight matters as much as whether you win, about the 8 snipers she had killed without hesitation because they were legitimate threats, and the one enemy commander she had refused to kill because he was unarmed and shooting him would have been murder regardless of tactical justification. And she told them about Marcus Vance, about the fact that he had tested her specifically to determine if her father's principles could survive combat or if they were idealistic fantasies that crumbled under pressure. She told them that she had proven those principles could survive, but that proving them had cost her brother's life and had extracted a price she would pay for the rest of her days. I cannot tell you what choices you will make when you face similar situations, she said to one class near the end of their training cycle. I can only tell you that you will face them, that combat will test you in ways you cannot anticipate, that you will be forced to decide whether winning matters more than how you win. When that moment comes, I hope you will remember that you are soldiers of the United States Army, that you represent something larger than yourselves, that the choices you make reflect not just on you, but on everyone who wears this uniform. Choose carefully, choose wisely, choose in ways that allow you to look in the mirror afterward and recognize the person looking back. 6 months into her assignment at Fort Benning, Maya received notification that a student needed remedial instruction in advanced ethics, that she had been specifically requested by the student's chain of command to provide one-on-one mentoring for a soldier who was struggling with the moral dimensions of sniper employment. The student was a 19-year-old private named Sarah Chen, small and quiet and carrying herself with the uncertainty of someone who had not yet learned to trust her own judgment. Maya met with Sarah after the regular training day ended, sitting across from her in a classroom that was empty, except for the two of them, and the silence that made conversation feel more significant than it would have in the noise and chaos of regular instruction. Sarah sat with hands folded in her lap, shoulders hunched slightly, eyes downcast in a posture that suggested defeat before the conversation even began. Your instructors say you are struggling with the ethical components of sniper employment, Maya said, keeping her voice neutral, offering observation rather than judgment. Can you tell me what is causing the difficulty? Sarah looked up, meeting Maya's eyes briefly before looking away again. I do not know if I can do this. The shooting part is fine, I am good at that. But the part about killing people, about being responsible for ending lives from distances where I cannot see their faces or know who they are beyond the fact that someone designated them as targets, I do not know if I can carry that weight. Maya recognized the struggle because she had faced it herself, had wrestled with the same questions before her father and Jake had helped her understand that doubt was not weakness, but rather evidence of conscience. That soldiers who did not question the morality of killing were the ones who needed watching most carefully. Tell me why you became a sniper. Sarah considered the question, choosing words carefully. I wanted to protect people. I wanted to be the one watching from a distance, keeping soldiers safe, making sure threats were eliminated before they could hurt anyone. I wanted to matter in a way that regular infantry did not allow. But now that I am here, now that I understand what sniping actually requires, I am not sure I can do what needs doing. What do you think needs doing? Killing. Without hesitation, without doubt, just following orders and taking shots and trusting that someone else has made the moral calculations so I do not have to. Maya shook her head slowly. That is not what needs doing. That is what people who do not understand sniping think needs doing. Real snipers, professional snipers, snipers who can live with themselves after combat ends, they understand that killing is not the mission. Protection is the mission. Killing is sometimes necessary for protection, but it is never the goal, never the default, never the first choice when other choices are possible. Sarah looked up again, and this time her eyes stayed focused on Maya's face, searching for something, perhaps reassurance or validation, or simply the confirmation that doubt was acceptable in a profession that seemed to reward certainty above all else. How do you know when killing is necessary? How do you make that choice when everything is happening fast and people are dying and waiting to be certain means failing to protect the people depending on you? The question struck close to the heart of everything Maya had learned in Helmand Valley, everything her father had tried to teach, everything that separated soldiers who fought with honor from those who simply fought. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, speaking with the intensity that came from experience purchased through other people's blood. You know because you have trained for it. You know because you have thought through scenarios before they happen. You know because you have internalized principles that guide action even when conscious thought is too slow to keep up with events. And you know because you have accepted that sometimes you will make mistakes, that sometimes you will shoot when you should not or fail to shoot when you should, and that accepting responsibility for those mistakes is part of the burden you carry as a sniper. What if I cannot carry that burden? What if I am not strong enough? Maya reached across the table and gripped Sarah's hand, feeling the trembling in her fingers, recognizing the fear that came from understanding what commitment to this profession required. Strength is not about carrying burdens without feeling their weight. Strength is about carrying them anyway, about acknowledging the weight and choosing to bear it because the alternative is setting it down, and some burdens cannot be set down without abandoning everything that makes the carrying worthwhile. You are strong enough. The fact that you are asking these questions proves you are strong enough. The soldiers I worry about are the ones who never question, who never doubt, who kill without conscience, and sleep without dreams and become monsters wearing uniforms. Sarah absorbed this, her trembling easing slightly, her posture straightening in small increments that suggested internal shifts toward resolution if not complete confidence. Your father taught this? This understanding that doubt is acceptable? My father taught this. My brother demonstrated it by dying to protect my right to make choices based on principle rather than expedience. I validated it by facing the hardest choice of my life and choosing honor over survival. Now I am teaching it to you so that when you face your moment, when everything is chaos and people are dying, and you have to decide what kind of soldier you want to be, you will have foundation to stand on rather than quicksand to sink into. Will you tell me about your choice? About what happened that was hard enough to test everything you believed? Maya hesitated, uncertain whether sharing the story would help or hurt, whether exposing Sarah to the full weight of what combat could demand was appropriate at this stage of her development. But she also remembered that her father had never sheltered her from difficult truths, had never pretended that being a soldier was anything except hard and costly and sometimes devastating in ways that training could not prepare for. So she told Sarah about Helmand Valley, about the ambush and the choices and the 8 snipers she had killed to protect rangers who depended on her shooting. She told her about Jake bleeding out while she was forced to choose between staying with him and continuing the mission. She told her about Marcus Vance stepping into the open unarmed and offering himself as a target to test whether she would compromise principles for tactical advantage. And she told her about lowering the rifle, about watching Vance walk away, about the cost that choice had extracted and the peace that choice had provided, and the certainty that she had made the right decision, even though the right decision had resulted in her brother dying, while believing she would honor the legacy he had protected. Sarah listened without interrupting, absorbing the story with the focus that students brought to lessons they recognized as essential, that contained information they would need when their own moments came, and choices had to be made without the luxury of time or distance or the ability to consult with others who had faced similar circumstances. When Maya finished, Sarah sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. Thank you for trusting me with that. Thank you for showing me that doubt is not disqualifying, that questions are not weakness, that being a sniper means being a guardian first and a shooter second. I think I can do this now. I think I understand what my instructors were trying to teach me and why it matters. Maya squeezed Sarah's hand once more, then released it, leaning back and returning to professional distance that was appropriate for instructor and student. Good, then go back to training with that understanding and see if it makes difference in how you approach the material and the choices you make during scenarios. I think you will find that clarity of purpose makes everything else easier, not because the work becomes less demanding, but because you understand why the demand is necessary. Sarah stood, came to attention, rendered a salute that was returned with the precision that marked professional acknowledgement of mutual respect. As she left the classroom, Maya saw in her posture something that had not been there when she arrived. Some straightening of shoulders and lifting of head that suggested internal transformation, from uncertainty to commitment, from doubt to determination tempered by healthy recognition of the weight that determination carried. Maya sat alone in the empty classroom for a while after Sarah departed, thinking about the conversation and the story she had told, and the recognition that teaching was its own form of protection, its own way of ensuring that deaths like Jake's and Luis's and Jackson's meant something beyond the simple fact of their absence. Every student she taught carried forward pieces of her father's legacy and Jake's sacrifice, carried them into future combats where they would face choices and make decisions and either honor the principles they had been taught or abandon them when abandoning them would make survival easier. Some would honor them, some would abandon them, but all would have been given the choice. All would have been shown that alternatives existed. All would have understood that how they fought mattered as much as whether they won. That was the promise she had inherited from her father and accepted from Jake, and was now passing forward to students who would become instructors themselves someday and teach other students who would never know David Cross's name or Jake Torres' story, but would benefit from the legacy they had built through dedication to principles that most people dismissed as impractical. The seasons passed in the rhythm of training cycles and graduation ceremonies, of students arriving uncertain and leaving confident, of Maya finding satisfaction in teaching that she had not found in combat despite being good at both. She was promoted to staff sergeant, then sergeant first class, rising through ranks based on excellence in instruction and the recognition that her unique combination of combat experience and ethical grounding made her invaluable for shaping soldiers who would deploy to places where those qualities would mean the difference between success and catastrophe. On the 5th anniversary of Jake Torres' death, Maya drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where he rested among thousands of other warriors who had likewise served and sacrificed. She found his grave easily, having visited enough times that the path was automatic, that her feet knew the way without conscious navigation. The headstone was simple and dignified, showing his name and rank and dates and the acknowledgement that he had died in service to his country. She knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the stone, feeling the granite warm from the Virginia sun, reading the inscription for the 1000th time, and finding in it the same inadequacy that all such inscriptions carried. Words could not capture who Jake had been, what he had meant, what his promise had cost, and what his sacrifice had provided. I kept teaching, Maya said quietly, speaking to the stone but meaning the words for Jake wherever he was, whatever peace he had found beyond the pain of dying and the weight of carrying promises for 20 years. I have taught 200 snipers the lessons you and Dad taught me. I have told them your story and his story and the story of what happened in that valley. I have shown them that principles can survive combat if soldiers are willing to pay the price for honoring them. Some understand, some do not, but all of them know that alternatives exist, that they have choices, that how they fight matters. She paused, organizing thoughts that had accumulated over 5 years of teaching and learning and carrying weight that never got lighter, but somehow became more bearable through the simple act of refusing to set it down. I miss you. I miss Dad. I miss the conversations we had and the lessons you taught and the confidence that came from knowing I had brothers who would stand with me regardless of what choices I made. But I am not alone. I have students who become brothers and sisters. I have Rangers who still remember what happened on Torres Ridge and who send their snipers to train with me because they trust that I will teach them to be guardians rather than just killers. I have purpose that extends beyond my own survival, that connects me to something larger than individual existence, that gives meaning to the weight I carry. A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling leaves on trees that had witnessed thousands of similar conversations, that had sheltered thousands of grieving soldiers who came to honor the dead and find strength to continue living in ways that honor their sacrifices. Maya stood, brushed grass from her knees, came to attention, and rendered a salute that held everything she could not express in words, everything that 5 years had not diminished, everything that would persist as long as she drew breath and remembered what it meant to keep promises that lasted beyond death. As she walked back toward her car, she passed families visiting their own dead, past other soldiers honoring fallen brothers, past civilians who had come to Arlington because something had drawn them to this place where sacrifice was acknowledged and memory was preserved, and the dead rested in ground that would be tended as long as the nation they defended continued to exist. She thought about Sarah Chen, who had graduated sniper school and deployed to Iraq and returned with her own stories of choices made and weights carried, and the recognition that doubt was not disqualifying, but rather evidence of conscience. She thought about the dozens of other students who had passed through her instruction, some of whom had written to thank her for lessons that had saved lives, or prevented mistakes, or simply provided framework for making sense of experiences that defied easy categorization. And she thought about her father, about the ranch in Nevada where everything had started, about the coyote he had chosen not to shoot, and the lesson that choice had taught about protection being more important than killing. That lesson had survived 3 generations now, had been passed from David to Jake to Maya, to students who would pass it forward to their own students in an unbroken chain that extended into a future she would never see, but had helped shape through dedication to teaching what her father had taught and her brother had died protecting. The sun was setting as Maya drove away from Arlington, painting the sky in colors that were beautiful despite the sadness that pervaded the place, creating visual poetry in a landscape dedicated to memory and sacrifice and the stubborn insistence that some things mattered more than individual survival. She drove toward Fort Benning where new students waited, where training would continue, where the work of shaping guardians rather than killers would persist because that work was never complete, because each generation needed teaching, because promises made to the dead could only be kept by living in ways that honored their sacrifices. That night, she sat at her desk and opened her father's journal to the last entry she had made, written 5 years earlier when she had first arrived at Fort Benning, carrying grief and determination in equal measure. She read her own words about keeping promises and honoring sacrifices and building foundations that would outlast individual soldiers. The words remained true, had been proven true through 5 years of teaching and hundreds of students, in the recognition that what she had inherited from her father and received from Jake was not burden but gift, not weight but purpose, not obligation but opportunity to shape the future in ways that honored the past. She picked up her pen and wrote the final entry that would close this chapter and open the next, that would mark the transition from student to teacher to mentor to whatever came next in a life defined by service and shaped by sacrifice and dedicated to ensuring that promises lasted beyond death and principles survived, combat and honor remained possible, even in professions built on violence. 5 years since Jake died. 5 years of teaching what he and Dad taught me. The weight has not gotten lighter, but I have gotten stronger. The grief has not disappeared, but I have learned to carry it with dignity. The questions have not been answered, but I have learned to live with uncertainty while still acting with conviction. This is what it means to be a guardian. This is what it costs to keep promises. This is the legacy I inherited and will pass forward until I can pass it no further. Some debts can never be repaid. Some weights can never be set down. Some promises can never be broken, without losing everything that makes keeping them worthwhile. I understand this now in ways I did not when Jake was alive and Dad was teaching, and I believe that understanding came from knowledge rather than experience. Knowledge tells you what to do. Experience teaches you how to live with having done it. I have both now. I will use both to ensure that the next generation learns what I learned and pays the price I paid and keeps the promises I kept. This is the last entry in Dad's journal. Tomorrow I start my own journal and I begin recording lessons for whoever comes after me. The circle continues. The promise is passed forward. The weight is carried because carrying it is the only way to honor those who carried it before us. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf beside the photo of Jake and her father, beside the flag that had draped Jake's transfer case, beside the letter he had written, and the memory she carried and the certainty that some promises lasted forever and some sacrifices meant everything, and some lessons could only be taught by people who had learned them through experience that could not be replicated in classrooms or transmitted through words alone. Tomorrow she would begin a new journal. Tomorrow she would teach a new class. Tomorrow she would continue the work of being a guardian in a world that needed guardians desperately and produced them rarely and honored them inconsistently. But tonight she sat in silence, honoring the dead, acknowledging the bomb, accepting the weight that guardians carried when they took their responsibility seriously and refused to set it down no matter how heavy it became. Some soldiers never speak of what they carried or how close everything came to ending beneath a silent ridgeline. But they stood their ground, took the shot when shooting was required, refused the shot when refusing required more courage than firing, and walked forward so others could walk home. Their courage deserves to be remembered long after the battlefield goes quiet, long after the last shot is fired, long after everyone who knew their names has likewise passed into whatever waits beyond the final breath. Maya Cross remembered. She would ensure others remembered. She would teach the next generation to remember and to honor and to keep the promises that lasted beyond death, and to find what it meant to be a soldier who fought not just with skill, but with honor, not just with courage, but with conscience, not just with determination, but with the understanding that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. The night settled over Fort Benning, quiet and heavy with memory, while somewhere in the darkness, warriors slept and dreamed of home, of brothers lost and promises kept, of the terrible cost of being guardians who protected from a distance and carried the weight of every choice across all the remaining years of their lives. And in the morning, the sun would rise again, and the work would continue, and the promises would be kept, and the legacy would persist because some things were worth dying for, and even more things were worth living for. And the difference between the two was what separated soldiers from warriors, and warriors from guardians, and guardians from the rare few who understood that the weight they carried was not burden, but privilege, not punishment, but purpose, not curse, but calling. Maya Cross understood. Her father had taught her. Jake had shown her. Now she would teach others until her turn came to pass the torch and rest beside the brothers who had gone before, secure in the knowledge that the promise had been kept, the weight had been carried, the legacy had been honored, and the work would continue long after her name joined theirs on stones that marked sacrifice and celebrated service, and reminded future generations that freedom has always cost more than most people understand and less than it is worth. The last promise had been kept. The final debt had been acknowledged. The circle was complete, but also continuing, ending, and beginning simultaneously, closing one chapter and opening the next in the eternal story of soldiers who serve and sacrifice and ensure that principles survive, even when survival requires everything they have to give. This was the weight guardians carried. This was the promise they kept. This was the legacy they left. And this was enough, more than enough, everything that mattered when accounting was made and lives were measured not by years lived, but by difference made and promises honored. And the simple fact that they had stood when standing required everything, and they had not faltered when faltering would have been easier. Maya Cross had stood, her father had stood, Jake Torres had stood, and now through teaching and memory and the determination to ensure their sacrifices meant something beyond their absence, she would help others learn to stand when their moments came and choices had to be made. And the only thing separating honor from expedience was the willingness to pay the price that honor demanded. That price had been paid. The promise had been kept. The weight was carried forward into a future built on the foundation of their sacrifice and dedicated to ensuring that foundation remained solid enough to support generations yet unborn who would face their own tests and make their own choices and either honor the legacy or abandon it. Maya would ensure they honored it. This was her promise. This was her purpose. This was the last entry in her father's journal and the first step toward building her own legacy that students would inherit when her time came to rest beside the brothers who had gone before. The work continued. The promise persisted. The weight was carried. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.